Bongbong Marcos set for a landslide win in the Philippines presidential race. Russian missiles target Ukraine's south, disrupting crucial supply chains. And Queen Elizabeth misses the opening of Parliament with ongoing health concerns. You're watching The World. Hello, I'm Beverly O'Connor. Also tonight, South Korea's new president takes office with growing concerns over Pyongyang's nuclear ambitions. Well, at least 7 people are dead, hundreds more injured in a wave of violence sparked by the resignation of Sri Lanka's Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa. The Prime Minister was evacuated in a pre-dawn military operation after thousands of anti-government protesters stormed his official residence in Colombo. Hundreds of pro-government supporters turned on anti-government protesters, and to restore order, Sri Lanka has given emergency powers to its military and police, with a curfew now in force. Here's Manny Tsigas.
Hundreds of ruling party supporters storm an anti-government protest site outside Sri Lanka's presidential office, tearing down tents and attacking its inhabitants. Protesters say they were also attacked outside the Prime Minister's Colombo residence. Their demands for the government to resign over Sri Lanka's worst ever economic crisis, igniting a tidal wave of violence.
It's about 20,000 came with sticks, heavy sticks, and they beat all of us.
Local TV showed angry mobs smashing and toppling buses reportedly used to ferry the pro-government supporters. Vehicles were also pushed into nearby waters before the crowds turned their attention to various buildings belonging to government officials. This is the ancestral home of Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa going up in flames. The crowds also tried to breach a compound where he was staying before police fired tear gas and live rounds into the air. The Prime Minister had resigned to make way for a unity government, which would see his brother remain as president. Speaking before the clashes, Rajapaksa's tone fluctuated between humble and defiant.
We must find a way to solve our problems. None of us have the right to ignore the Constitution. My policy is to face challenges and overcome them. I am not in the habit of running away from challenges.
But Rajapaksa's critics are holding him responsible for the chaos that followed.
Everyone involved in this government, including the President and Prime Minister, must be held responsible for this inhumane attack. This was a planned attack, a thought-out project. This was an act of state and political terrorism.
Police say the violence led to several deaths, including an MP who shot 2 people when a mob swarmed his car before killing himself. While calm has returned, a nationwide curfew has been extended, with the military and police given emergency powers to detain people without warrants. Manny Tsigas, ABC News.
And we'll cross to Colombo for the latest on the ongoing unrest shortly. Well, voters in the Philippines have returned the Marcos family to power just over 3 decades ago. A popular revolution overthrew the corrupt regime of dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Tonight, his son, Bongbong Marcos Jr., is heading for a landslide win in the country's presidential election. Our East Asia correspondent Bill Birtles reports from Manila.
Celebrating victory and the return of the Marcos dynasty. As unofficial results came through, supporters at Bongbong headquarters partied.
After we vote, we go here to support and wait for the result, and now we won!
More than 30 million Filipinos cast votes for the senator, more than twice that of his closest rival. But with the results still to be confirmed, Mr. Marcos held off declaring victory.
I want to thank you for all that you have done for us. There are thousands of you out there, volunteers, parallel groups, political leaders that have cast their lot with us.
Despite problems with voting machines in multiple districts, the results mirror what the polls predicted.
It is clear that the thoughts of the people are becoming known.
But some are concerned about the Marcos family's legacy and its brazen corruption.
The sentiment of the majority, if they are siding with Marcos Jr., it just represents that the systems have failed us.
We think the next 6 years will be riled by corruption, inflation, by a lot of economic downturns.
Bongbong Marcos's victory comes after a years-long effort to rewrite history and portray his father's 21-year rule as a golden age for the country. Experts say Bongbong's plans are far from clear.
Many of the people are speculating and have no access to direct information from the campaign about what he would do in the next 6 years.
Observers say one thing that is likely is Bongbong Marcos moving the Philippines closer to China. The US backed his father's dictatorship, but pulled support when the regime began to crumble. Some believe bitter memories for the son of the dictator may shape his views towards Washington. Bill Birtles, ABC News, Manila.
And we'll get more on what another Marcos presidency means for the Philippines with Peter Harcher. Well, the US president says he is concerned that Vladimir Putin has no way out of the war in Ukraine and says he's trying to work out what can be done. Russia has launched more missile attacks on the southern port city of Odessa, and its troops are storming the last Ukrainian holdout in the steelworks in Mariupol. Europe correspondent Nick Dole is in the capital, Kyiv.
As the streets of Moscow filled with flags, Russians marched, as they do each year, to honour the millions who died in the Second World War. Polls suggest about a third of Russia's youth don't support the war, but still, many more believe the message of their leader.
No enemy will break us. We are the country that won't bow before anybody.
There are only a few dissenting voices here.
I feel very sorry for the civilians who are suffering in Ukraine, the children, the old people. They're suffering for nothing now.
Millions of Russians have fled the country. This Moscow couple is now living in London.
We struggle with Russians' disbelief in it. It's just horrifying. It's like a country of zombies.
In Moscow, there were some protests during Victory Day. This sign saying no to the new war was quickly removed. And as millions were watching the spectacle on television, a hack on Russian smart TV sets showed a message saying the blood of thousands of Ukrainian children is on your hands. Protesters threw red paint at the Russian ambassador in Poland as he tried to lay a wreath in a Soviet military cemetery. The Kremlin was furious and launched an official complaint. There's no pause in the fighting. Russian missiles struck the southern port city of Odessa. 5 buildings were destroyed, including a shopping centre. The military parade in Moscow wasn't the only display of Russia's military assets. Ukraine's government was all too happy to put these on show. Here in Kyiv, some of the burnt-out Russian hardware has been dragged into the city as a kind of trophy for Ukraine's military wins. This war isn't even close to being over, but people here are hoping this is the only kind of Russian tank they ever see again. In Mariupol, occupied by Russian forces everywhere except the Azovstal steel plant, a Victory Day parade was held on one of the few streets that haven't been destroyed. A carefully planned display to show the world Russia is in control there. Nick Dole, ABC News, Kyiv.
The head of Australia's overseas spy agency has suggested more Chinese officials are leaking information to his intelligence officers because they're unhappy with Beijing's trajectory under Xi Jinping. In a speech to the Lowy Institute, Paul Simon said Australia was facing a difficult strategic climate, but China's authoritarian turn also offered opportunities to his agency.
What we're seeing is more and more signs of officials, individuals, interested in a relationship. That's not coercion. That is very real concern about their culture, the lack of diversity in their culture, and the direction that they're heading in.
Mr. Simon also warned the contentious Solomon Islands-China Security Pact was a big deal for the region. Well, Prince Charles has taken centre stage at the opening of Britain's Parliament, replacing his mother, Queen Elizabeth. The 96-year-old missed the grand set-piece event for the first time in almost 6 decades because of ongoing mobility issues. The Prince of Wales read out the government's legislative agenda, which ranged from domestic issues like the cost of living and border protection to the war in Ukraine.
In these challenging times, Her Majesty's government will play a leading role in defending democracy and freedom across the world, including continuing to support the people of Ukraine. Members of the House of Commons, estimates for the public services will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, other measures will be laid before you. Her Majesty prays that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your councils.
South Korea's new president has been sworn in at a ceremony in Seoul using his inauguration speech to outline how he'll tackle a pandemic-hit economy and the growing threat from North Korea. Yoon Suk-yeol was the Prosecutor General for his predecessor before he resigned amid internal feuding and joined the main Conservative opposition party last year. The 61-year-old won a tight election in March on a promise to strengthen the country's military alliance with the United States and build up its own missile capability. While he promised a tougher stance on Pyongyang during his campaign, today he avoided those same words, with concerns increasing that the North might be preparing for its first nuclear bomb test in nearly 5 years.
While North Korea's nuclear weapon programs are a threat not only to the Korean peninsula and to that of Northeast Asia and the world, the door to dialogue will remain open so that we can peacefully resolve this threat. If North Korea genuinely embarks on a process to complete denuclearization, we are prepared to work with the international communities to present an audacious plan that will vastly strengthen North Korea's economy and improve the quality of life for its people.
Let's return to the unfolding crisis in Sri Lanka, where violence has erupted after the country's Prime Minister resigned last night. Senior researcher at the Centre for Policy Alternatives in Colombo, Bhavani Fonseca, says protester demands are still not being met by what remains of the government.
The demands have been there for several weeks, and I think the peaceful protesters were getting really frustrated that their demands were not being heard by the government. And the Prime Minister's resignation came after violence was unleashed on peaceful protesters. So, this is a very, very dynamic situation in Sri Lanka, where, for several weeks things were very, very peaceful. And things changed quite dramatically yesterday when the thugs associated with the government just went out and started destroying and attacking protesters. That is unfortunate because what followed after that was violence across Sri Lanka, and violence that could have been really prevented if this government took action early on.
Yes, that state of emergency really seemed to have provoked this desperation. What is your expectation as to what might happen, as to whether the army will pull back, the armed forces will pull back in terms of the way protesters are being treated?
Well, as we speak, we are in a state of emergency, and there's a curfew, island-wide curfew, and this was the curfew was imposed yesterday because of the violence. Regardless of the curfew, many were on the streets protesting, continuing to call for the resignation of Gotabaya Rajapaksa. But it seems like the violence is somewhat under control in the last few hours, though we are still hearing reports of particular incidents. So it's worrying. It's extremely unstable, and there's worry that there'll be new cycles of violence coming out. Now, emergency is likely to continue till Parliament meets, or if the President decides to revoke it. So it's really something with the President. But I think think, well, with the violence, the government will make the case that emergency needs to continue and the military presence is required. So it's very, very alarming developments on the ground in a context, and I want to reiterate this, in a context where peaceful protests happened for several weeks. I mean, nearly 2 months of peaceful protests, and it's unfortunate that it has got to this point.
What do you see happening with the president? I mean, some of the anti-presidential protesters had to be protected by lawyers. They are still wanting the president to resign, of course, the brother of the prime minister. Do you think that is just a matter of time, or does he need to stay there to get the next steps underway?
Well, the demand is clear, Beverly. I mean, the president has to go. I don't think we're going to be able to address all the problems in Sri Lanka if he continues to hold on to office. And this stalemate is likely to continue. So I would urge those around him and the president that to heed the calls of the protesters and resign. I mean, his resignation provides for particular scenarios to take place, which is provided by the Constitution. So, you know, the president resigning can lead to a peaceful transition where there is an election of a president by parliament. The opposition parties and others can come to an arrangement. So these are ongoing discussions, but it needs to start with the president resigning and allowing for a peaceful transition in Sri Lanka.
Is there any sign he will do that?
Well, so far, unfortunately, we don't see him even recognizing that there is the violence that has been erupted. I mean, he did tweet yesterday, but other than tweeting, we have not seen any real action from the president to address the ground realities, the violence that's spreading, but also the calls, the demands of the protesters. So it seems it's a president that's very much tone deaf to what the protesters and the public is calling. And inaction from his side is really detrimental and directly linked to the instability in Sri Lanka.
And therefore, the urgency for a restructure of Sri Lanka's debts so that the IMF will consider some form of relief package must just be suspended at this point.
So the government has commenced discussions with the IMF, and these are just discussions. This has not led to a deal, and so this is to be seen how far this is going to go. And I want to be also very clear, an IMF deal is not going to solve all the problems. There's much more that's required, restructuring the debt and so many other measures. But one needs to have confidence that the government in place in Sri Lanka is able to do it. And at the moment, I don't think the public nor the international community has that confidence, nor does the government has the legitimacy. So there is this massive political crisis in Sri Lanka coupled with the economic crisis. And for that, you know, there are particular steps that can be taken. And the first step is really with the president.
Yes. In terms of an alternative leadership, is that still not 100% clear, given the president needs to be the one to make the first move?
Well, the opposition parties and the different stakeholders are having conversations. This has been there for some time now, and there are different names being thrown. And I think, you know, this is something that will have to be decided. But the first step is for the president to leave, then for parliament to meet and take the next steps. And the Constitution, as I mentioned before, does provide for certain things to happen. But the opposition parties also need to come together, recognizing we are in crisis mode. We've been in crisis mode for some time. But there's also, you know, there's some problems in terms of the opposition coming to a common platform. So those are also challenges that need to be addressed quite urgently. Otherwise, this uncertainty is going to continue to the detriment of this country.
Always appreciate your time, Bhavani. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Beverly.
Women have taken to the streets of Afghanistan to protest against the Taliban's face scarf decree. Over the weekend, the Taliban's supreme leader ruled that Afghan women must cover their faces. Most of the country's women wear a burqa for religious reasons, but many in urban areas don't wear face coverings. Since regaining power, the Taliban claimed it had changed since it last ruled, but in recent months it has increased restrictions against women, including limiting them from travelling without a male chaperone and banning men and women from visiting parks at the same time. Well, the election contest over the cost of living has sharpened, with Anthony Albanese taking the unusual step of backing a big rise in the minimum wage. The Labor leader says he doesn't want workers going backwards, but the coalition's been quick to warn an increase on that scale could trigger higher inflation and force the Reserve Bank to lift rates faster and harder. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
They have some of the most important jobs, but these aged care workers are among the lowest paid. Just $22 an hour, little more than $1 over the minimum wage.
I believe the minimum wage should at least keep up with the cost of living.
Anthony Albanese's put wages at the centre of his election campaign. Today, he put a number on it.
You don't want people to go backwards. Does that mean you would support a wage hike of at least 5.1% just to keep up with inflation?
Absolutely. No Australian government or opposition has ever put a figure on the rate of the annual wage increase. And yet Mr Albanese today has done just that.
Mr Albanese, you said wages absolutely...
Although Labor later insisted it would not put a specific number in any formal submission to the industrial umpire on the minimum wage.
Thank you.
What's controversial about wages keeping up with the cost of living?
Has Anthony Albanese considered whether this decision will have inflationary impacts?
Inflation, currently just over 5%, is expected to peak at 6% by year's end. Unions demanding a 5.5% rise for more than 2 million Australians on award wages.
Any increase less than 5.1% is a real wage cut.
Higher costs have to be passed through into prices.
Whether he intended it or not, Anthony Albanese has effectively declared 5.1% a fair wage rise for the lowest paid workers. It will have popular appeal, but given economists and the business community warn it would also drive up inflation and interest rates even faster, expect Scott Morrison to refocus on the Labor leader's economic credentials. Then again, the PM's own personal investments are proving to have a poor return. His captain's pick candidate, Catherine Deeves, effectively withdrawing her apology for calling gender reassignment surgery mutilation.
That was inappropriate.
Look, that is actually the correct medico-legal term.
This is a significant surgical procedure that completely changes someone's life, and it should never be entered into lightly.
You have implied that young people 18 and over enter into a fundamentally life-changing surgery lightly.
You're implying that. I'm not implying that.
A culture war that harms the vulnerable few, and for what? A candidate with little chance of winning. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
Well, let's return to the UK, where for the first time in 59 years, the Queen's annual speech was delivered without the Queen because of ongoing health concerns. Prince Charles took on the official duty of outlining the government's agenda for the year ahead. Our Europe correspondent Isabella Higgins is outside Parliament and she is with us now. Isabella, quite significant to think that this is only the third time the Queen has missed the opening of Parliament.
That's right, Bev. In fact, the last time she missed this was in 1963, and she only missed it one time prior to that. And on both of those occasions, it was because she was pregnant with her two sons. Now, the state opening of Parliament may not sound like the most exciting or important event, but for the royal family, it is considered one of their key duties as head of state. It's where the monarchy interacts with the country's parliament. And you can see just behind me, this is the Palace of Westminster. It's a building steeped in tradition and ceremony, but this regular event that happens had to be altered somewhat today because the Queen was unable to attend. Prince Charles filled in for her making the speech, and also his son, Prince William, joined for the first time in an official capacity as part of the royal procession. They arrived here at the Palace of Westminster, made their way through the halls, and then officially took their spot on the throne and made that speech to Parliament. And this is a very important address where they outline the government's agenda for the parliamentary year ahead.
As you point out, it's also not just the parliamentary year ahead, but it's an important opportunity for the Johnson government to reset after a series of scandals. What is it trying to bring up in terms of its legislative agenda?
Well, from that speech today from Prince Charles, what we heard is that the Johnson government will very much be focusing on economic issues, things like the cost of living, which have really been a hot button topic here in the UK. Also issues like energy reforms. Power bills have been another huge topic of conversation here in the UK. But we also heard many other issues mentioned: the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, providing ongoing support to the National Health Service after the pandemic, and also some other issues like reforms to border controls and also controls of protest. Now, it is probably important to note that this is something more of a wish list than a definitive guide to all the things that the Johnson government will be able to achieve in this parliamentary year ahead.
The opposition leader, Isabella Sir Keir Starmer, is himself under quite a bit of pressure after a video emerged of him eating and drinking in an MP's office last year. How serious is this for him?
Well, we have seen that the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson was embroiled in a similar scandal for years, and at one point it looked like it was going to cost him his job. He managed to survive even though he was penalised for breaching the lockdown laws that his government set. So now we're almost seeing a parallel with Sir Keir Starmer, although Labor is very adamant that the circumstances are very, very different, although it too is under a police investigation. There was a video that emerged of him drinking in an MP's office. Now, Labor is saying that it was just a meal break while they were working at an important by-election. And Sir Keir Starmer has come out and made somewhat of a political gamble. He said that if he is issued a penalty notice, that he will quit his job, obviously making a commentary on Prime Minister Boris Johnson. But it is quite the gamble, and really he is laying his political life on the line over this, and it's something that could play on for weeks yet as this police investigation plays out.
Isabella Higgins, outside Westminster, good to talk. Thanks so much. Well, a famous silkscreen portrait of Marilyn Monroe by the pop artist Andy Warhol has sold at auction for more than $280 million. The piece, Shot Sage Blue Marilyn, is one of a series of works made of the actress after her death in 1962. Tension was high in the New York bidding room before the hammer came down. The sale price was a little lower than expected, but still broke the previous record for an American artwork at auction set in 2017. The US newspaper The Miami Herald has won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news, with judges praising its coverage of the collapse of a high-rise building that killed 98 people. The New York Times won the Pulitzer for national reporting for its coverage of fatal traffic stops by US police. The committee also awarded a special citation to journalists of Ukraine, acknowledging their courage, endurance and commitment in covering the ongoing Russian invasion. The Pulitzers are considered the most prestigious award in US journalism. A Chinese cargo vessel has docked with the core module of the new Tiangong space station in preparation for the arrival of a new crew in June. The Tianzhou-4 spacecraft was launched atop a Long March 7 rocket from the southern province of Hainan. The freighter's carrying supplies for the next crew's 6-month stay. The previous crew returned to Earth last month after 6 months on the station. China intends to finish building the station this year with the addition of 2 laboratory modules in July and October. You're watching The World. Our top stories tonight. At least 7 people are dead and hundreds more injured in a wave of violence sparked by the resignation of Sri Lanka's Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa. Bongbong Marcos Jr. heading for a landslide win in the Philippines presidential election. And Prince Charles takes centre stage at the opening of Britain's Parliament after his mother, Queen Elizabeth, was unable to attend because of mobility issues. Well, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi is likely to make a surprise visit to Solomon Islands in coming weeks. A senior Solomon Islands government source has told the ABC preparations have begun for Mr. Wang to visit the capital Honiara later this month, potentially before the federal election is held. It's another sign China is intent on cementing security and commercial ties with the Pacific Island nation, while Canberra is busy with the upcoming vote. Sources have also told the ABC they believe Mr. Wang will probably travel to Honiara accompanied by a large Chinese delegation as part of a broader visit to a number of Pacific Island countries. Well, the US President Joe Biden has condemned a protest by pro-choice activists outside the homes of 2 conservative Supreme Court justices. Our North America correspondent Carrington Clark has more from Washington.
In the immediate aftermath of the leaking of this draft decision by the Supreme Court, which would overturn Roe v. Wade, we saw immediate protests down at the Supreme Court here in Washington, D.C. Since that time, there have been put up unscalable fences around the Supreme Court, similar to what that were put in place after the riots outside the Capitol building. And then what we saw later last week was this left-leaning group, this pro-abortion rights group, Ruth Sent Us, posted online the addresses of the Supreme Court justices, and we saw then protests held outside the private residences of 2 of the seen as conservative-leaning justices on the Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh. On top of that, we've also seen some seemingly violent protests around the country, targeting both Catholic churches and anti-abortion rights groups in Wisconsin, which appears to be an arson attack. Originally, when the White House was asked about the protests that were taking place last week, they emphasised the right of people to peacefully protest, and that the President, Joe Biden, understood the passion in this issue and understood the need to protest. But today we've seen from the White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki a condemnation of these attacks.
Violence, threats, and intimidation have no place in political discourse. Yes, we are a country that promotes democracy, and we certainly allow for peaceful protest in a range of places in the country. None of it should violate the law. No one is suggesting that.
Let's return to the Philippines, where Bongbong Marcos is on track to become the country's next president in a landslide vote. His father, Ferdinand Marcos, was thrown out after a peaceful revolution and is said to have stolen over $10 billion in state funds. International and political editor at the Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Harcher, says political amnesia is partly responsible for Marcos Jr.'s rise.
It really is. The family had to be evacuated by a US Army helicopter from the presidential palace to save them from the mob, as millions of angry Filipinos made Manila ungovernable. And now the son returns in triumph to the scene of the father's disgrace. The father got away with looting the state for something up to $10 billion US. The state has only managed to recover from the family about $3 billion of that. The rest of the money, goodness knows, but a lot of it seems to have been spent on campaigning for Bongbong, the son Marcos's return to power, or ascent to power, and his astonishing social media campaign. It seems to have combined with other factors to just completely, in the words of Maria Ressa, the Philippines journalist who won the Nobel Prize for her fearless reporting, she said, history has shifted before our eyes as social media was just swamped with this revisionist story of Marcos, who was this horrible looter, abuser of human rights and dictator, has now been rehabilitated to be a great national hero and a victim of elite persecution. And his son brought back. So the combination of flooding social media with a new narrative, the fact that most Filipinos are young, average age is very young in the Philippines, and most don't have any direct memory of those years, and the fact that a fortune has been spent on this rehab job. It's all come together to produce this astonishing outcome.
Yes. One thing is this doctored image of what the previous Marcos regime was like. But on that social media campaigning, there was an absolute vacuum of policies, a vacuum of what his vision might be for the Filipinos. So why did they turn to him in so many, in such large numbers?
Well, you're right, Bev, and the absence of any real policy or scrutiny has made it very hard to know what this bloke intends to do with his newfound power. He's the first candidate for the presidency in decades who refused to participate in any of the pre-election debates and avoided mainstream media interviews altogether and only talked to sympathetic media outlets. So he is a bit of a blank space, and that's a bit of a worry. But the vacuity of his policy platform has been simply overpowered. One element has been the Philippines has always been a country that loves a little bit of a persona, a touch of Hollywood. They're not so much interested in the substance. That's always been the case in the Philippines. But it's also the fact that this victory represents the union of two great dynasties. The outgoing President Duterte, who has a powerful family dynasty of his own, his daughter Sarah has joined as vice president, with Bongbong Marcos as president. So that brings those two families, those two big, wealthy, powerful dynasties now together. And that produces a lot of patronage, a lot of networks, a lot of profile. And the West isn't entirely free of dynastic politics itself. One of the funny elements of coverage of this election, Bev, has been US coverage, which is full of tutting about the loss of democratic mores in the Philippines and overlooking the fact that this bloke's father was a US-backed strongman and dictator, and the fact that the US has some strong dynasties of its own, including the Clintons and Bushes ruling in Washington. So it's not the only country in the world subject to these syndromes, but it is subject to big personality cult, and it is subject to dynastic politics.
One of the key questions will be, I mean, his predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte, was sort of all over the place when it came to a relationship with China. Do we have an idea as to how he will treat China, given there are some contested issues between the Philippines and China?
Well, he said very little about it. A couple of things he has said. One is that he thinks that the only option for dealing with China is a bilateral negotiation. As you know, Bev, the Philippines took China successfully to the International Tribunal in The Hague over China's claim of maritime territories that were also claimed by the Philippines. The Philippines won that case. The tribunal found that China had no legal basis to its claim. But Bongbong Marcos has said it's not an arbitration if only one of the parties respects the outcome. Therefore, it's effectively, he said, it's useless. And so the country will be reduced to a bilateral discussion with China. So that's one pretty strong clue. He said that the US relationship is important but could be recalibrated and left that hanging. But a couple of indicators we have in the absence of anything firmer from a more sort of articulated policy. One is we know that he's an Anglophile. He spent time at Oxford as well as the Wharton Business School in the US, and had his son educated in Britain. We know that he doesn't have a sort of fetish for the other strongman leaders like Putin or Xi Jinping. And these at least are helpful indicators that the guy mightn't be quite as smitten, shall we say, with Xi Jinping or other strongman characters as his predecessor, Duterte.
You talk about those two dynasties, though, that have come together with Marcos and Duterte. Are we sure that the same sort of path won't be followed as his father took, that the sort of brutality, the state capture?
Oh, absolutely not. All the indications are it will be exactly in that model. The overwhelming political power that these two dynasties bring, the fact that they have both come from backgrounds with autocratic and corrupt tendencies, the fact that they've shown very scant regard for democratic mores, for scrutiny, suggests that we are looking at exactly that sort of routine. And the fact that Bongbong Marcos's own power and political movement is based on ill-gotten gains from his father's looting of the state, all of these things portend to a pretty illiberal democracy. But he is a new leader. We have to live in hope.
And we do that every week. Peter, good to talk. Thank you so much.
It's the only way to get through, Beth.
Absolutely. Well, Russian President Vladimir Putin is fighting to maintain public support for his war in Ukraine, but there's already considerable disapproval among Russia's youth, and some predict that will only grow. Here's Europe correspondent Isabella Higgins.
It's been more than 10 weeks since Russia launched its assault on Ukraine. It's difficult to get accurate data on just how many in the country support this war, but polling from the independent Levada Centre suggests about 81% of Russians support the military operation. But among young voters, that figure drops to 71%. Still a majority, but some younger residents say as sanctions hit and Western corporations leave Russia, they are deciding whether they flee or face an uncertain future, including the possibility of mass conscription.
The people that I socialize with, they're privileged Muscovites, and many of us have left. I think that what Putin did he obliterated and really erased all the future that could be possible for Russia.
Their parents, they just they argue with them and they start saying that you're not my daughter, you're not my son.
Do you see a future for yourself in Russia?
There is no more Russia that we knew before February 24th. It's just gone. It's a personal choice, I guess, that's like people make, and like among our generation, like there's this big divide, like that there are people who stay and fight and people who leave to live their lives.
Russia's President Vladimir Putin addressed the nation at Victory Day celebrations on Monday. He used the anniversary of the Soviet Union's defeat of Germany in World War II to blame the West for encroaching on Russia's borders.
To me, it's not a war between Russia and the Ukraine. It's a war between Russia and the West. And the Ukraine is just a territory that happens to be in the between those regions.
For now, even among young people, it seems many Russians are listening to their leader's message.
The Northern Territory's Chief Minister Michael Gunner has resigned from the top job. He made the shock announcement in Parliament today, saying he could no longer give 100% after the birth of his baby boy.
The birth of our second child, the week before last, confirmed something for me. My head and my heart are no longer here. They are at home.
After close to 6 years in the top job, the Chief Minister steps down.
There is never a perfect time to step back, to walk away, to give others a go. But for me, for my family, this feels like the right time.
The morning of the Northern Territory budget instead dominated by the shock announcement.
The Territory is now entering a new era of growth, of opportunity, of possibility. And a new era should have new leadership.
But shock announcements are nothing new for a Chief Minister who led the Northern Territory through some of the most tumultuous times in Territory history.
The consequences will flow as a result of that investigation.
Michael Gunner joined the Northern Territory Parliament in 2008, elected the member for Fanny Bay, before taking the Labor leadership in 2015 and leading the party to a landslide victory as he became Chief Minister a year later. A leader elected on promises to turn the Territory around.
They have rejected the chaos of the last 4 years.
But his time in Parliament hasn't been without chaos of its own.
It will live as a stain on the Northern Territory's reputation.
Embroiled in turmoil over government grants.
I believe we failed to communicate expectations about how we handled this.
allegations of reckless spending,
the government is making it up as it goes along,
and accusations of environmental backflips.
We have been sold out.
A Chief Minister with waning popularity went into 2020 facing the prospect of electoral defeat, a heart attack signalling the start of a challenging year, quickly overshadowed by the pandemic.
2020. Bloody hell.
His leadership during the pandemic winning him praise, although not without criticism. The Chief Minister finishes his time in the top job handing down a budget in better shape than years past. His time in politics isn't over yet, staying on as the member for Fanny Bay.
I'm a proud Turkey boy. Born here, grew up here, working and raising a family here, and I'll die happy here.
Sitting on the backbench as his family takes centre stage.
A major drug trafficking operation has been uncovered in New South Wales after a deadly accident at Newcastle. The body of a professional diver was found floating in the city's port with more than 100 kilograms of cocaine. Detectives suspect the man was trying to collect the drugs from the bottom of a cargo ship. Here's crime reporter Mark Reddy.
At 200 metres long, police divers have their work cut out for them, scouring the ship for drugs. With a body found floating nearby, detectives say this was no amateur importation.
This was a well-drilled professional group targeting our community with his poison to sell for a profit.
100 kilograms of cocaine has been seized, the original shipment believed to be triple the amount. Some of it was seized from under the vessel, similar to this police operation carried out in Port Botany in 2019. The bulk carrier, Areti, is registered in the Marshall Islands. Police say it travelled from Panama to Argentina, where it picked up soy powder. It left the city of La Plata in early April and arrived a month later in Newcastle on Sunday afternoon. The man found dead in the water was equipped with professional diving gear. Investigators suspect he was a foreign mule sent to retrieve up to $120 million worth of cocaine from the hull.
I'm not surprised because drugs are quite prolific in the Newcastle area.
They don't have enough officers to control the port. That's the big problem.
2 boats, an inflatable and a tinny, was spotted in the area hours before the man died. Police believe multiple people were involved in the importation and that the man who died may have travelled illegally into Australia before the ship arrived. Inquiries are now underway to determine his identity to see if he had any connections to an international drug syndicate. 400 kilograms of cocaine was dumped from a bulk carrier off South Australia in March. Investigators say drug traffickers are now targeting smaller regional ports like Newcastle, hoping for more success. Mark Reddy, ABC News.
Well, with COVID infections surging since borders opened, doctors are bracing for more people to develop long COVID. Leading GPs in Queensland want the state government to set up dedicated services for patients with the debilitating condition.
This is about the most energy 38-year-old Matt Schneider can muster these days.
Archie, come here.
The vaccinated father of 3 had a relatively mild brush with COVID in late January, recovered and returned to his hectic life. But 1 month later, he was struck down again.
At the drop of the hat in the middle of the day, I would feel so fatigued I just had to find something soft to lie down on.
The town planning consultant lost about 25 kilograms. Eventually, tests showed a secondary lung infection. He's now improving with medication and rest.
3 months is a long time to wait to start feeling a little bit better.
The definition of long COVID is still evolving. The World Health Organization calls it post-COVID-19 condition and says it occurs usually 3 months from the onset of COVID, with symptoms that last for at least 2 months.
Ongoing chest pain, shortness of breath, tiredness, or cognitive dysfunction.
5 months after the virus took off in Queensland, the state could be on the precipice of a wave of long COVID.
I think we can expect those cases to really ramp up over the next 2 to 3 months.
The question of just how many people end up with long COVID is hard to answer. Doctors say the definition, the vaccination rate and the variant all play a role. A study from New South Wales last year found 5% of people who had COVID still had symptoms 3 months later. GPs believe Queensland should follow many other states and set up dedicated services with teams of healthcare specialists.
These clinics should have already been established. We knew that COVID was going to hit our shores.
Queensland Health says it's actively considering options which may include clinics. In the meantime, those with lingering symptoms should see their GP. Emma Pollard, ABC News.
A young fossil hunter in England has found a tooth from one of the world's largest prehistoric sharks. The megalodon tooth was found on the Suffolk coast by 6-year-old Sammy and could be up to 20 million years old.
The tooth of one of the largest prehistoric sharks, extinct for roughly 3.5 million years. It's a discovery that any experienced paleontologist would be thrilled with. But this megalodon tooth was unearthed by a 6-year-old, and now Sammy and his fossil are the talk of his school.
Sammy, I like your fossil. I think the tooth is heavy. It's really big, and megalodons are from ages ago.
But what does Sammy make of it all?
So it's like so big, and I didn't know what even it was.
And how did you find out what it was?
My daddy told me.
There were clearly some very serious fossil hunters down there with all the proper gear, and then me and Sammy in muddy boots walking along the beach, hoping to find the shark's tooth, and instead turning up this megalodon tooth.
Megalodons are thought to be the largest fish that ever lived. A megalodon's full body length can range from at least 13 metres up to a maximum of 18 metres, or almost the length of 2 double-decker buses. It was the last bank holiday weekend here in Bordsey in Suffolk where Sammy struck lucky.
Sammy has been to this beach before, but he was looking for shells. But inspired by talking to fossil hunters, he decided to try and look for shark's teeth. So this was his first attempt at doing so. And of course, he found one. But at first, he didn't realise how special it was.
There's a part of me that has been looking for a megalodon tooth since I was 6. So I haven't found one yet. I'm very, very pleased that he's found one.
Sammy has now taken to sleeping with his special tooth. This might be a once-in-a-lifetime find, but for this 6-year-old, he's determined it won't be his last.
The Tasmanian Jack Jumpers have flown to Sydney for tomorrow night's do-or-die game against the Sydney Kings. With Sydney leading the best-of-5 grand final series 2-0, only a Tasmanian victory will prevent the Kings from being crowned NBL champs. But the first-year Jack Jumpers are not going to go down easily and are still smarting after Sunday's drama-filled loss.
Public enemy number 1 in Tasmania, Chase Buford, the Kings coach, now infamous for this kick.
Chase Buford is headless.
No suspension though from the NBL, just a $375 fine for the blatant act of aggression on Sunday.
Obviously I'll be paying for the board, a little fine on top of it, but I've got to figure out a way to control my emotions.
Buford's Kings eventually prevailed in Game 2 via this game winner from DJ Vasiljevic.
DJ Vasiljevic, a dagger!
Tasmanian fans incensed, so much so Vasiljevic says he received a death threat via social media.
Just a bunch of keyboard warriors, I think, that can, they be tough behind the screen.
The Kings confirmed today they're pursuing the matter with Basketball Australia.
We'll definitely be looking into it and making sure that doesn't continue.
It's inexcusable in sports. We're here to entertain. These are young guys playing their hearts out.
Kings co-owner Paul Smith further antagonised Jack Jumpers fans, saying those hoping for a Cinderella story should acknowledge superior talent. The Jack Jumpers believe the series is closer than it seems.
We're gaining momentum again. It would have been good to get Game 2, but, as you can see, we're right there.
As for Sydney's injured MVP, Jalen Adams, he trained today and will be a game-time decision.
I wasn't expecting him to do as much just now as he did, so the coaching staff was pleased to see how he's moving out there.
A Sydney win tomorrow night will mean a first championship in 16 years for the Kings. If Tasmania prevails, it'll be back to Hobart for Game 4 on Friday. Chris Rowbottom, ABC News.
Let's get a check of the weather. Here's Paul Higgins.
More heavy rain for Queensland. Those heaviest falls will move east to be over the central coast tomorrow. There'll be less intense rain over New South Wales and northern Victoria, the far east of South Australia and eventually Tasmania. Tomorrow night, some rain will move into the west with some good falls expected down in the southwest corner as the cold front links up with tropical moisture. For your Wednesday, the amount of rain for Brisbane has been cut back to 35 to 60 millimetres. Sydney will have 3 to 8 millimetres, and in Perth, late showers will bring 4 to 8 millimetres of rain. In Canberra, an afternoon shower or two. Adelaide will have late showers. In Hobart, partly cloudy, becoming cloudy in Melbourne, and in Darwin, a partly cloudy day.
Our top stories tonight. At least 7 people have died and hundreds more have been injured in a wave of violence sparked by the resignation of Sri Lanka's Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa. Bongbong Marcos Jr. heading for a landslide win in the Philippines presidential election. And Prince Charles has taken centre stage at the opening of Britain's Parliament after his mother, Queen Elizabeth, was unable to attend because of ongoing health issues. And that is your world for this Tuesday. You can watch the show on iView, and there are more world news and interviews at the ABC's YouTube channel. I'm Bev O'Connor. Good night.
My fellow Australians, right now everyone wants to buy your vote. So we're back to show you how your democracy is being sold and bring you all the inside information of how the pollies are trying to spin it to win it. Join our panel of experts, insiders and me, your election guide, Will Anthony Green.
Gruen Nation, tomorrow at 8 on ABC TV and ABC iView. Spoken by Will Anderson and the voiceover guy who has to do this bit as fast as possible.
Every Thursday on Q&A, we put your questions to our nation's leaders.
I'm really just looking for a candidate and a party who I know I can trust.
Are you confident right now? 2 and a bit weeks to go.
Nothing says the law of diminishing returns quite like Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government.
Coming up, undecided voters put their questions to Paul Fletcher, Simon Reynolds, Caroline DeRusso and Intifar Chowdhury. Plus, live music from Vicar and Linda. Q&A, Thursday. Island Paradise.
Behind the postcard facade, native Hawaiians have a different story to tell.
Hawaii is being sold to the global elite.
Systematized theft. Many are struggling to survive.
History has been hidden from our people.
Kanaka Maoli Hawaiians are looking to themselves for solutions.
Rediscovering culture and strength.
Resistance is how we heal.
Like a modern Hawaiian renaissance.
We are not going to be quiet.
Foreign Correspondent, Thursday at 8 on ABC and ABC iView.
Comedian Griff Rhys-Jones is taking in an immense,
huge
and almighty land.
This truly is Canada. Magnificent.
The only way.
Oh! Did you hear that?
He knows how.
Welcome aboard, sir. Thank you.
What we're using is what nature provides.
It looks like magic to me.
Griff's Canadian Adventure, Saturday at 6 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Board shorts. They're quick drying, designed by surfers for surfers.
Buddy and I would like to buy the license to sell Lightwave in the US.
You two stole all of my contacts, and you went into business without me.
Did you know he was carrying the drugs?
What have you done?
He's falling apart in there.
We're gonna make it up to him.
Barons, Sunday 8:30 on ABC TV or stream the series on ABC iView.
May 21, Australia decides.
Together we can build a better future.
Strong economy means a stronger future.
Who will be our next PM?
Because we're backing you.
Australians deserve better.
Join Australia's best political minds as we bring you live results seat by seat.
Lost 1 or 2 seats to independents.
Can the coalition go a 4th term or will Labor rise to power? ABC Election Night, Saturday, May 21 on ABC or live stream on ABC iView.
How about you come on a journey with us?
You with me, guys?
Let's conquer the world.
Wow.
I decided to stand up last night and I'll continue to stand up.
We'll be braver and smarter and stronger in love.
Who is brave? Me. Yes.
I'm getting quite emotional.
Gets your heart racing.
Turned into such a crier.
We're going to understand racism. You are pioneers.
I'm on my quest for true love.
Good evening, Yvonne Yong with the top stories on ABC News. In an unusual move, Anthony Albanese has endorsed a minimum wage increase of 5.1% to keep in line with inflation. The Labor leader says he doesn't want workers going backwards, but the coalition has labelled the move a thought bubble and again questioned his economic credentials. The ABC understands Comanchero bikie Tarek Zahed and his brother Omar have been shot in a fatal shooting in Auburn in Sydney's west. Police have confirmed one man is dead, but it's unclear at this stage which of the pair has died. The other remains in a critical condition. The shock resignation of Northern Territory's Chief Minister Michael Gunner has been met with mixed reaction. Mr Gunner announced his resignation in Parliament, saying his head and heart are no longer in the role. Deputy Chief Minister Nicole Manison will act in the role until a new leader is chosen. Authorities in Sri Lanka are trying to maintain a nationwide curfew following violent protests after the resignation of Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa. At least 7 people have died and more than 190 people have been injured in violence that's seen homes of politicians set alight. The protests have been triggered by an economic crisis. Those are the latest stories on ABC News.
Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning, coming to you from rainy Rockhampton in central Queensland. The last time we were here was 2019, when the giant Adani coal mine proposal was a lightning rod for political debate. Tonight we ask, what's got the attention of the locals this time? And we're here at the Rockhampton Museum of Art, and joining me on the panel, Isaac Shire, Deputy Mayor, Labor Party member and drum regular, Kelly Vivi. Great to see you in person, Kelly.
Thank you for having me.
Been a couple of years. CEO of the Rockhampton Jockey Club, Liberal Party member and former CEO of Beef Australia. Ian Mill, great to meet you, Ian.
Thanks, Ellen. Nice to see you.
We also have tonight General Practitioner and Chair of the Fitzroy Community Hospice, Dr Vicky Richmond. Lovely to see you. And ABC Capricornia breakfast radio presenter Paul Culliver. Thank you for coming in, Paul, and replacing a guest who couldn't get here. You said you'd do it for me this morning, and there you are. We're not up past your bedtime, are you?
No, it's quite all right. It's my bedtime once this program ends.
OK, bed by 7. And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're on Facebook. First today, aged care workers from Western Australia and Queensland, including personal care workers and cleaners, went on strike today over pay and staffing shortages. But the Fair Work Commission instructed South Australian workers not to strike due to safety concerns for the aged care residents they'd leave behind. Already, there are estimates that there'll be a shortfall of 110,000 aged care workers right across this country in just 8 years' time. There are 12 aged care facilities here in Rocky, but demand for beds continues to outstrip supply and there are not enough workers to staff them. Reporter Stephanie Bolchi has more.
More than 100 residents call this aged care facility home, and construction is underway to house another 30 people. But still, that won't cover the wait list.
Currently, our waiting lists have 80 people waiting for residential aged care, so that would include our respite care.
So downstairs in level 1, we have 27 residents.
Recruiting skilled staff is tough at the best of times. They just aren't applying at the rates needed, and COVID has added an extra layer of complexity.
Rita, I just want to introduce you to, she's one of our new staff members.
Just trying to retain staff has been difficult because of working conditions and pay rates and a pandemic, but attracting new staff extremely difficult.
These are issues felt across Australia and why fed-up workers walked off the job today. The strike impacted 5 major providers representing 120 facilities from Perth to Townsville.
staff missing breaks.
Kerry is one of the union members on strike. She normally organises residents' activities, but lately has been drawn in to help with personal care.
At the moment, because of short staffing, cuts on budgets of all sorts of things, I'm being pulled off my normal job and being put on the floor. But that's still not making up for the short staffing. We're still down a staff or two most days. We're down staff up to 4 staff a day. We can have late hygiene, we can have late meals, staff missing breaks, staff wearing themselves out completely, and there's no support.
Workers on minimum wage are paid based on their skills and how long they've been in the job. But unions say these classifications are outdated.
I was very close to leaving not long ago, but I love my job. My job is for the residents, not the paycheck. Paycheck would be handy.
The Fair Work Commission is currently hearing evidence about whether to boost the minimum wage by 25%. A supervisor's wage would increase, for example, from $970 to more than $1,200 a week.
Provider representative bodies want whoever is elected to government to be responsible for paying for the wage rise. Both the Liberals and Labor say that they'll support the independent tribunal's findings, but Labor says that it will fully fund it and will put that in writing to the Fair Work Commission.
Workers at this facility are paid just above the minimum wage, but the CEO agrees that she'd like to be paying more.
We absolutely are underpaying our staff, not just benevolent, I'm talking the whole industry.
Aren't you responsible for the wages? Can't you do something about that?
70% of our funding comes from the government and 30% comes from the consumer, and there's lots of rules around what we can charge a consumer. At the moment, 80% of our operational revenue is funding Labor.
The Fair Work Commission case won't be determined until after voters go to the ballot box.
Vicky, let's start with you as a GP in the area. You've had the experience of going into aged care. Is the situation in terms of staffing as dire as the strikers are suggesting?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the whole sector is in crisis, not just in Rockhampton and central Queensland, but across the country. And our vital aged care workers are saying enough is enough. You know, this is not a new problem. Aged care has been understaffed and undervalued for decades, but I think the crisis with the COVID pandemic has just really tipped the situation over. I can really see where the strikers are coming from.
Yeah, you use the word chaos to describe what it's sometimes like in aged care.
Absolutely. You know, my experience as a GP going into some aged care facilities is, it's heartbreaking, you know, in some situations to see. Look, the chronic understaffing is a real issue. So as a GP, I can walk into an aged care facility and struggle to find a staff member to even, you know, meet me, help me find where the resident is that I'm seeing, actually where their room is. There's so much turnover in terms of staff, so many locum staff that that real continuity and the understanding of who the patient is, what their values are and what's important to them is just really lost in that chaos. So it's a very challenging place to work for me as a GP going into an aged care facility, but even more so for those incredible staff who do work there, and I think we have to really step back and think about their well-being, because unless we have well, thriving staff looking after our elderly folk in these rest homes, then we've got no show of providing the quality care that they deserve and need.
Once again, Kelly, you have done the 5-hour drive?
I have.
From Moranbah to Rockhampton to be here for this program, and you may not be able to get back because of this weather. Is that right?
Look, that's right, but a couple of extra days, away from the teenage kids, I'm sure they won't mind anyway.
But okay, so it's a remote area where you live, and so when elders in your community, older people in your community need residential aged care or more support at home, what sort of services are available?
There's very limited services in the region that I live in. You can either travel hours either side. So people generally, if they're looking to go into aged care, need to leave the region, leave their families and leave their home. we've got a small number of beds in one of our communities that has more of an aged population, and that community is coming together with some community funding, putting together a project and looking to solve their own problems. I think that the people of Claremont are tired of waiting for government solutions.
So they're actually trying to build their own residential aged care facility?
Absolutely, yes, yeah. Like out in regional areas, people, I think, get really tired of waiting for those solutions, and their community group is coming together. They've got a building that had been previously used, and yeah, that community group is looking for funding, they're getting the project scoping, and they are just not waiting for government because they're trying to look after the most vulnerable people in their community.
And Paul, that's a story you've been covering too.
Yeah, it's clearly a thing that while you have the bigger regional centres of central Queensland like Rockhampton, Gladstone, even further out, Biloela, Emerald, where you've got some aged care facilities, there's lots of towns in central Queensland. Some of them are hours and hours apart from each other. And so the idea of, well, if myself or a loved one in my family has to go into aged care, I want it to be in the town that they grew up in or that they call home, that I can go visit that family member. You know, it's a 5-minute trip from home, hopefully, rather than, oh, it's a day trip. I have to drive an hour and a half. I spend how much time with them and then come back. And so, yeah, like in Claremont, a town like Mowra, which is also a place that is, you know, has a whole lot of coal mining in that region, they themselves have also said, we need beds here. We need beds in the hospital. And so they are also a place that have come up with a solution. They've said, hey, let's just fund a handful of beds, and then at least some people in this community can have that aged care right in their own community. Yeah. And so it's community-based.
Ian, you have lived many lives in central Queensland. So let me just run the audience through. CEO of the Rockhampton Jockey Club. We described you as a former CEO of Beef Australia, but you're also the former CEO of Mercy Health and Aged Care Central Queensland. That would have been a huge concern. That was health services, hospitals and aged care.
It certainly was that one, and I couldn't agree more with the other panel members here. Mercy Health and Aged Care was a large organisation. We had over 1,500 staff, about 4 aged care facilities, and a number of acute facilities as well. And I haven't been in the sector now for a number of years, but it appears as though the funding formula hasn't changed, and it certainly needs to. It's,
but you would have been the boss there. So when striking aged care workers say, I tell you what, we're going on strike for the residents.
Yeah, I could relate to that. It is. Look, it's an area of service that is it's very emotive. I mean, you've got you're caring for the vulnerable people, for the aged, and their families are having to make very big decisions about putting mum or dad in care, and that is just it's gut wrenching to do that. And then if you have insufficient staff and maybe inappropriate facilities on some occasions to provide those services, it's devastating for the staff and certainly for the families and the residents that are being cared for. It's yeah, and I don't think it just relates to wages. I think it's the whole funding model for aged care. It needs to change. And it must be terrible for families who are living in the smaller centres who have to send off ageing residents to other towns. That's just not acceptable.
Was it hard? We were just hearing Vicky saying that there's a lot of turnover of staff. Part of the what the Fair Work Commission is hearing as part of this claim for a 25% pay increase, which sounds a lot, but I think it takes it from $23 an hour to $28 an hour. I think it's around about what you get paid at Bunnings. That they're asking for parity with disability and hospital workers. Now, you've just said pay alone is not everything, but would that start to help the issue?
Oh, look, definitely it would help keep staff. I mean, aged care, and I've worked in palliative care as well, they're very specialised areas, and I think that people have I don't like the word passion, but people have a love of doing that and working in those areas, and they're committed to that. And to hear the earlier cut from one of the workers who is struggling now and is motivated not by the money but by the care that they provide, I think that is a genuine concern by a lot of people working in the industry.
Vicky.
So just to follow on from that, I think you're absolutely right, Ian. You know, healthcare workers in general go into this profession, in the nursing, medical, allied health and caregiving professions, because they have a genuine desire to help our community. But when you put great people into sometimes toxic and really challenging environments for long enough, you know, things fall apart. And I think that's what we're seeing. And yeah, it's time that we really need to look at the well-being of our workforce.
How are we had the Aged Care Royal Commission come down with its findings last year now, Vicky, looking at nursing staff on site all year round, all day round, 24/7, looking at more minutes for patient care, all that sort of thing. Do you see that any of that filtering through to the sorts of services that are on offer in Central Queensland?
Not in a large way, no. I think there's been small attempts at patching up some of the holes in aged care. I know there's been real effort put into enabling younger residents to come out of aged care facilities and have other options. But, the report of that commission, a huge part of it was around the workforce, and really that hasn't been touched, and I think that the fact that we've got a strike today reflects that, the workforce and the people in these aged care facilities and their families are sick of all the talk and not the action to really make a meaningful and profound difference to their lives.
Just before we move on, Paul, there's another gap in the sort of service provision you're talking about. Kelly's talking about there's just nowhere, and maybe older people have to leave home, as you said, to a town an hour and a half away to find residential aged care. What's the gap? Because presumably there are high care beds in hospitals, but what's missing other than the aged care residents? There's lots of other options that older people want in terms of care at home. Is all that missing? Is it?
I think there's probably a shortage of something maybe Vicky knows a bit more about, but I think, at the end of the day, it's about people being able to live in their own communities, and there is that stage that maybe you need a carer to come and visit, whether it's a bigger part of the day or a few hours or whatever, just to check on you, that kind of thing. And at the end of the day, it's just a question of whether we actually are getting enough workers into the region that want to do that and are filling those roles, and if the funding's even there.
Yeah, just before we move on, I know that, Vicky, a passion of yours is palliative care. You come from New Zealand 6 years ago.
That's right.
The situation is much better there. What's the worst case scenario for somebody wanting to die with dignity in this part of the world? What has to happen?
Oh, look, palliative care is such an important issue, and it's something that affects all of us. Death and dying is something that touches all of us at some point in our lives. And I think one of the key things that I found when coming to Central Queensland is a real lack of community-based options. So here, like in many parts of regional Australia, the option is just not there to die at home in a supported and cared for way. And large numbers, the vast majority of people are ending up in hospitals and environments without the people around them that they most want to have at the end of life. So in response to that, myself and a number of members of the community locally here have sought to change that situation essentially, and 18 months ago came together to collaborate and pull together our skills and expertise to lobby and really ensure that we get adequate community-based facilities and services here in the region.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of community-based action to solve these sorts of problems.
Right? Action.
Yeah. Well, aged care is just one part of a bigger picture in Rockhampton. Health far outstrips mining as the biggest employer in town, but access to health services is still under constant pressure. Rural and regional healthcare deficiencies were highlighted in the recent inquiry into the sector, and the National Rural Health Alliance estimates there's a spending shortfall of about $4 billion annually across the country. And again, I suspect, Ian, we're going into territory which is, this is the exact sort of frustration as to why you're not in that area anymore. Is this the sort of thing that frustrated you and made you go, you know what, I think I'll go to the jockey club. Let's look at horses. Right, beef, yes. Yes.
Look, it is a challenge, and it's not only in Rockhampton. Regional Australia suffers generally from the lack of specialists available, a lack of investment in healthcare. And again, it's the situation where if someone's requiring a particular treatment, and they're made to relocate to Brisbane or to travel to Brisbane. They're removed from their family and their support network.
And is Brisbane really the next option, is it? Because Brisbane, how far's Brisbane? What, 8-10 hours in the car?
Oh, 7 hours. An hour and a half flight, an hour's flight. So,
right.
I mean, it's very accessible, but you then think about the dislocation of the family and then not having the support of your family around you. Look, all regional centres in Australia struggle to attract qualified practitioners, whether it be in health, aged care, mining, accounting. Regional Australia is dudded, I believe. We just miss out. There should be a lot more attention. I know I'm drifting off the subject, but to, I think, relocation of head offices of a lot of the government departments to regional centres where they actually belong. You know, why would you have the office looking after agriculture based in Brisbane when Rockhampton, for instance, I'm not saying it should only be Rockhampton, is the centre, is beef capital of Australia. There's more cattle out west here than there is in the rest of Australia. The mining industry, why should they be based in Brisbane? There should be some decentralisation, which I think would take pressure off the infrastructure required in cities and would boost areas like Rockhampton and smaller regional centres. Our smaller towns out west are dying, and they're dying because there are no services, there are no jobs for their children, and they have to leave town. It's very sad.
Paul, you got to Rocky in 2020.
2 years ago, yep.
Just in time to be locked down.
Yes, that's it. Yep, timed it well.
If you wanted to see a GP, now you've met Vicky, so presumably you could solve your problem, but let's imagine you hadn't met Vicky today. If you wanted to see a GP, how long would it take you to get in to see someone?
Oh, I guess lucky a couple of days. I've heard reports of weeks or even more than that. There's just no availability. You have to book in well in advance. So the idea of I used to be used to like, oh, I'm sick today, I need to get a doctor's certificate. That's all right, I'll go see the doctor sometime this afternoon. No, you have to go when you're already recovered a couple of days later or a few weeks later and go, oh, I was sick 2 weeks ago, can you sign me a doctor's certificate? And that's just obviously, the least serious of problems to go see a doctor for, which of course then puts more pressure on our hospitals, leads to more ramping. And then the idea of getting a specialist, well, either you're on a really long waiting list to see a specialist that's coming to Rockhampton or the region, or again, you're getting on a plane, you're paying several $100s to get on the plane, or the cost of a fuel, tank of fuel to get down to Brisbane and back. So
and
that
the accommodation when you're there, presumably, for
and that's the
friends and
judgment call
relatives.
that people literally have to make. They go, do I wait for the specialist, or do I, stump up my life for a few days and go down and see the specialist when they're available in Brisbane or the southeast corner of Queensland?
How does it work in Moranbah?
Oh, look, it works. There's different challenges in all the little communities in our region, but we're screaming out for doctors and healthcare workers and childcare workers and teachers. But, the issue of GPs in particular and medical practitioners is there's been town hall meetings in the last year because at different various times there'll be no doctor in a community. And then you'll come to a place like Moranbah that services, we service up to 28 mines, in this region, and yet the emergency department doesn't have a doctor in it. Or, we're completely understaffed, underfunded, under-resourced. And to be honest, the communities have had enough. They've had enough. And we do have community groups trying to be innovative and really showcase their communities to the doctors and welcoming them. Absolutely. It's not for lack of trying. And, I think it's the Regional Institute of Australia just released data that there's 84,000 vacant jobs in regional Australia right now. So when Scott Morrison's talking jobs, I think out where we are, we're talking wages, conditions, incentives. Because we have a lot of jobs, but if you need two of them to exist, I suppose it's not that attractive for people to come on out.
Do you worry? Do you worry for the GPs and the health professionals who come that they'll just get burnt out?
That's one of the main concerns, and to be honest, in communities like Moranbah, Dysart in particular, Claremont, all these little mining towns, that's exactly what everyone's worried about. Their GPs are just such valued people in their communities. The last thing people want to do is burn them out, and then there'll be no one to assist, and that's the biggest fear, and these doctors are going above and beyond what anyone would even dream of asking them. So the fear of burnout is real.
So why did you come to Central Queensland from Aotearoa, New Zealand?
Yeah, and do you want to come out west?
Yeah, so I guess we're a little bit of a good news story. My husband's an orthopaedic specialist, so he'd done all of his training in New Zealand and myself in general practice. We had finished some subspecialist training in Sydney and had a year of intermission, so we decided to come to Rocky and on a 1-year contract. And yeah, within 3 to 6 months we'd discovered just what a great place it is, what great opportunities there are to raise a family. We felt that the opportunities as, you know, education, hobbies, other activities. You know, Rocky in Central Queensland punches far above its weight, and yeah, we could balance that with the kind of lifestyle that we wanted, you know, that more relaxed pace of life, and yeah, a community around us that really cares and we feel connected to. So yeah, for all of those reasons, as well as jobs that we really felt were fulfilling and that we enjoyed, we decided to make Rockhampton home. So yeah, that was 6 years ago now.
And without wanting to dwell on the negative, those figures from the Rural Health Alliance there of a $4 billion shortfall across regional and remote Australia, that didn't surprise you when we talked to you earlier today, because you're seeing, I take it, a major piece of reform needing to happen to bring health outcomes in this part of the world up to where they are in the major capital cities. Would that be right?
Oh, look, absolutely. And I think, you know, for too long, our politicians and our bureaucrats to some extent too have tried to put band-aids on, you know, simple solutions for really complex problems. And our healthcare system is complex, and it needs vision and it needs a strategic approach. And I think coming up to elections is the classic time where we see, all these little announcements and attempts at winning votes, but when you're actually a healthcare worker and you're on the ground and you know what the real issues are, you realise that they really aren't going to come close to fixing the problem. It's a bit, there's lots of issues, but there's also a lot of really amazing healthcare workers out there and a lot of leadership in this area and a lot of great resources. I think we just need to, it's about collaboration, and it's about working across sectors, I think, as well. We can't just keep pouring money into healthcare, but we can use what we've got more effectively.
And I think one of the we should move on, but one of the proposals is around community-controlled primary health networks. And again, that's a bit of a theme emerging of take what the locals are saying, listen to what the locals are saying, leverage what they're capable of organising themselves, and kind of get out of the way of that progress in a way as part of the answer, rather than turn up and here's a swimming pool, here's a netball court.
If I could just make the statement that Australia does have a very, very good health system. I think that we just need to look at how the resources are allocated. I think we do need in Australia a balance between the public and the private sectors, but there needs to be also, particularly in regional centres, a lot more collaboration and cooperation, the point that you raised, Vicky, between those entities. It's ridiculous. We've got two wonderful private hospitals in town and a great public hospital. There should be a sharing of resources so that we shouldn't be duplicating services. And I know it's a difficult thing to negotiate and a difficult thing to agree on, but let's specialise in certain areas so that we don't have a little bit of specialisation here, a little bit of specialisation there. Let's not compete. And just getting back to the cost of people having to go to Brisbane and other centres for care. I mean, there is a community. There is funding for people that have to do that. But if you look at the funding, the amount of money we spend as a state government sending people to and from Moranbah or Rockhampton or Mackay to see a specialist, it'd be better. That money would be better spent in having the services available locally.
Yeah. Well, for years, if you needed rehabilitation support for alcohol or drug addiction in central Queensland, you had to travel more than 600 kilometres to Brisbane. The delay was in part over concerns about where this service would be set up, but now it's on the outskirts of this city and it's up and running, and the clients have come from near and far, as the nurse team leader Narelle Bevan told our reporter Stephanie Bolchi.
We've been open for about 6 months now, and we've had about 192 inquiries and admissions. Everyone's recovery journey is different. The clients that we're getting through the door, there's no other place that they can go that's like this. It's just so unique. There's all different reasons why people abuse substances, and it's anything from, PTSD to mental health issues. There's all different reasons. What we do here is often a last resort for people, and our catchment area is huge. We have a lot of clients from all over Queensland. Probably half of the clients that come through the doors, their main substance of concern is alcohol, followed by about 38% that are methamphetamines, and the remaining is cannabis. It's a 6-week program. We're non-punitive, they're all voluntary. We just completely support them 100% along the way with their anxieties, fears, and we really tailor the care to what their recovery needs are, not just the substance of choice that they're currently on. We do everything from engaging them in cooking classes. There's an amazing gardening program that we do here. We assist with budgeting and just making sure that their mental health needs are met, as well as their physical needs. We link them in with GPs. Long term, we also make sure that they've got those supports in the community. I think there's that stigma as well in the community, and we just need to shake that because we're making changes for the best, and something that's been really, really needed here.
You are watching The Drum, and with me on the panel, Isaac Shire, Deputy Mayor and Labor Party member, Kelly Vivi, CEO of Rockhampton Jockey Club, Liberal Party member and former CEO of Beef Australia, Ian Mill is with us, GP and Chair of the Fitzroy Community Hospice, Dr Vicky Richmond, and ABC Capricornia breakfast radio presenter up past his bedtime, Paul Culliver. The Drum was last in Rockhampton 3 years ago when the hot button issue was the proposed Adani mine development, and Bob Brown's convoy was infuriating pretty much everyone up here. Protecting the mining way of life was a key theme. Labor was all for that in its campaigning in Queensland, but there was a strong sense that Labor had a different message about coal and climate on the hustings in, say, Victoria. In the end, Labor was smacked politically in the poll, ouch, and holds no seats outside southeast Queensland. Back then, Kelly was with us too, and she told us about the frustration in this community when Bob Brown's convoy rolled into town.
And I think the insulting feeling really comes from, you get these group of people, which obviously we've been listening to this protest and this issue for 8 years. It's not like we haven't heard it before, and it's not like we're disengaged and we're not listening. But to have a group of people travelling up the coast, you know, on roads that have been built by mining, in the metal cars, with their phones, you know, turning up in a place like Claremont, who has been mining for generations. It's one of the original mining communities, and turning up on their doorstep with people like me who've been there for generations telling us it's time for us to turn our industry off for the greater good. I mean, it's condescending. Yeah. It's offensive.
3 years later, has anything changed? Kelly?
Well, we're not seeing a convoy exactly this year. I think what has changed is the conversation has moved along, you know, in the last few years. I think that in 2019, what was so polarising about having that convoy roll through town and tell people who'd been doing, you know, mining in their area for 150 years how things were going to be, really made it difficult to have genuine conversations with community about climate change, about transition, how people were feeling. And to be honest, it really felt in 2019 like when you cast your vote at that ballot, when you cast your ballot, it was really about, do you want your job or not? And that was what mine workers were telling us at the polls in 2019. I don't feel that same sentiment at the moment.
Was that sentiment fear as much as anger?
Yeah, I think it was. I think it really was. There's certain ways to have conversations with people, and particularly in regional areas. And I think that, you know, that was really damaging to our ability to understand the context of what people were saying. And I'm not sure Bob Brown was actually really looking for a conversation with communities like ours. And I think they felt it. People in regional communities, as you can tell, are pretty hardy people. They look for their own solutions. They look after themselves. And I think that convoy, you know, was probably the most damaging thing. And it's left a lot of scars, I think, for politically, and I think for the topic of climate change in our region.
And in the end, the giant mine that was proposed by Adani hasn't been built. I mean, a mine has been built, the railway line has been built. I think they're looking to produce about 1/6 of the coal that they're sort of licensed to produce, but they're shipping it at a time when it's record coal prices, absolutely record. Now, how has that changed the conversation? Because at once you're saying people have moved on. They're more willing to have the conversation about what's next, not next year, but in coming years. But at the same time, the price is gangbusters.
And this is where you've got to understand how it is out in our region when we are trying to talk to people about climate change and transition. You know, at the moment, you know, we've got a lot of pressure on us to start talking about how we want our communities to look, but yet we're record-breaking at the moment, you know, $100 billion in met coal exports, and, you know, our region produces a third of it at the moment. So, you know, we've got more mines opening up right now. We're not seeing a decrease in demand, and we're not seeing mines shutting down. You know, we've got 28 currently operating coal mines. There's 2 under construction, 4 under expansion. Things are getting bigger, but that's how things work in the industry. It's not a decision of our communities. That's a decision of demand in the market. And as for Adani's coal mine, you know, they'd reduced their applications for tonnages, I think, when they realised go bold was really about go bold and be conditioned as such. I don't think that was a response directly to protest.
No. That was just a commercial decision.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do think that every mining region is different. So when you look at the Hunter, you look at the Latrobe Valley, and you look at places like Moranbah, we're all mining different things. We all have different timelines on these fuels, and, you know, met coal exports will probably have a different timeline. But that's why it's important that while, you know, we're doing record-breaking exports, isn't this the time that we take those royalties and generate them back into communities for solutions beyond mining, whatever those timelines might be?
And that was really came through in some of the thoughts you were having when we were talking as a show to you before the program. Is if you've got boom times, invest for the future and acknowledge that the future is going to change. Do you think, Ian, that the inevitability of that energy transition, I'm not talking about the timing, just the inevitability of it, is now settled and accepted here?
No. I think there is certainly a lot of community discussion, a lot of discussion nationally that should happen. But I think until government, industry make the decision and start to spend the resources that we're now generating into different areas, I think people will then realise that. I think that they will accept that, and they'll come on board with it. But
so
look,
who doesn't accept it right now? Not so much accept it, because that's. You're getting into that language Kelly's talking about, aren't you? Do you accept, you know, are you or have you ever... What is the attitude of somebody who perhaps doesn't want to look at that future? And that's a terrifying thing to do, right?
I think the public generally is being bombarded, and more so now around election time, with all sorts of facts and figures. And I just think people are sick and tired of hearing the argument, to be really honest. People don't know what to believe. They don't know what... Is the science right? Are the sceptics right?
That's still a debate.
Look, I think so. I think so. Well, look, certainly that's my sense. And people I speak with, I certainly gather that from them. I think they would be more on board if, as Kelly alluded to, if there was a plan. We are making record. I mean, the amount of money that's coming into Australia through mining, we should be looking at that and redirecting that. To decentralisation would be one thing, but looking at renewable energies, looking at all sorts of things that we can do, turning water back into the centre of Australia so we can...
All right. OK, that's something completely different.
Yeah, I know. But,
well, I want to play you something from your radio show this morning. Despite the future of coal mining being a huge issue, the Miners' Union told you this morning they say no one's actually doing anything to address what a transition to a low-energy future means for this region. Queensland District Vice President Shane Brunker spoke to Paul on ABC Radio Capricornia this morning. Let's listen.
We've had several state budgets and also federal government budgets. There has not been 1 cent set aside for the transformation of the coal industry, which is going to start to take effect in 2027. Until we start to see some money on the table and some projects being identified and earmarked for people to come out to the regional areas, at the moment, transformation has just been token words.
Is that true? I mean, for all this talk about transition for all these years that Kelly and I have been talking, you've literally got the local mining union boss saying, nah, there's no plan on the table.
There's lots happening. There's green hydrogen being, explored in Gladstone. There's lots of, you've got Andrew Forrest and Fortescue Future Industries wanting to, build an electrolyser there. There's the idea of critical minerals. We need heaps of these different critical minerals to build renewable energies of the future, like batteries and solar panels and all sorts of things. These are all things that we can do here in Central Queensland. We can also build renewable energy, and we are doing that. There's lots of solar, there's lots of wind. So there's clearly industrial options for us.
I think Adani is even looking at a hydrogen plant. But at the same time, it's just a thought bubble. The idea of using green hydrogen, which is renewable energy, to make hydrogen, to produce steel, which at the moment you need metallurgical coal for, it seems a long way off, Kelly.
Look, it does seem a long way off. I mean, you've got Adani's got the only solar farm that has actually been built in our region at the moment. Coal miners, the mining companies are actually being forced to develop their own plans around decarbonisation, and we are seeing that. In the last few years, we have seen major changes about how mining companies are being conditioned environmentally.
But they're still in the business of coal. And so what I'm trying to get at is, and maybe go back to Paul, you talk to this community on the radio through the region. Do people believe that there are going to be enough jobs when Twiggy Forrest rocks up and starts talking about green hydrogen, when Anastasia Palaszczuk talks about green hydrogen, when Adani talks about green hydrogen? Do they think, oh, well, that's what's going to happen here?
People aren't sure. People aren't sure that there's going to be enough jobs and that they're going to be as high paying, because we've seen things like this, the side of the LNG industry in Gladstone. It was a sugar hit. Construction came, people moved in, lots of jobs, boom time in the real estate market, and then all of that construction was done, people moved away, it was gone. People are scared the same thing's going to happen in Gladstone and other towns, that you get a sugar hit when it comes to jobs in construction for renewable energy, and then it goes away. There, of course, are ongoing jobs, but is it enough? Is it the same? People aren't sure. So people are scared of some people are scared of the word transition. They prefer transformation, because transition could imply that you get left behind. Transformation is, what do I get to do in the future?
Yeah. Vicky, do you see that in the GP surgery, the anxiety affecting well-being?
Absolutely. I have a number of patients who work in the mines out west and often go out for a week at a time and back to their families for a week. And, job security is a huge issue. It's a huge issue for well-being, and for families here in the local area. And I think what you were mentioning before about transition is totally correct. And my patients are wondering, if I don't have a job at the mines, am I going to will I be qualified? What can I actually transition to another job in a different industry? So yes, there may be opportunities, but can I do those jobs?
And that's the lack of planning, I think, that Shane's probably referring to as well, that there currently are no plans in terms of, reskilling, upskilling, remediation strategies. There's no multi-level government incentives. There's no plans at the moment. And each mining region will require its own localised plan if we really actually do believe in transition past that.
Okay. Let me just ask you, sorry to interrupt, Kelly, on this one. Are there mixed messages, though? Because the Prime Minister was in this part of the world at the end of last month talking about $275 million for hydrogen projects in central Queensland, the green jobs from the transition to fossil fuels. But then you had Senator Matt Canavan, who's essentially a member of the National Party, LNP, saying, no, net zero's dead. And, he's pretty sceptical about these hydrogen jobs. So, I mean, there's often a complaint in this part of the world that parties say one thing down south and another thing up here. Is that happening again?
Well, isn't it ironic that Matt Canavan's actually the one saying that now, and that was his greatest accusation in 2019? So, if we're
against the Labor Party.
Against the Labor Party.
Do you think that's is that a problem? I mean, some critics have said the coalition's walking both sides of the street here.
It's a major problem, and it stops the conversation from actually happening. I think the greatest tragedy of coming out of this boom that we're currently in will be getting another slideshow from our Prime Minister about climate action. I don't think anyone agrees that we are still debating net zero. Let's just move on. Let's put the plans in place, and communities will feel better, and local councils are prepared to do the work. But you cannot leave these plans at the behest of a mining company and local councils and just expect that a mining company is going to have a social conscience on exit. That's not fair to the workers, and it's not fair to communities. And governments have to get involved, and they're not.
There has to be leadership, stronger leadership from both parties, whoever's successful. They need to stand up. I think the Australian...
Canavan's got an office just around the corner here. When he says net zero is dead, Ian, as a member of the party, do you say, well, that must be the truth inside the party room and the coalition, or do you think he's a maverick?
No, I don't. I don't think he's a maverick, but that's certainly not dead. And I think you get the same message from both parties.
What does it mean? Do people understand what it means? You don't know what it means?
No.
Do you know what it means, Kelly?
Oh, look, I think...
The discussion's stopping, is that what it means? I don't know, but it's certainly not stopping.
I had to look it up, so go on. Do you know exactly what it means?
That means
net zero.
Oh, it's about reducing our carbon emissions right down to, you know, nothing. And I think that that's a journey, and I think that every single industry should be looking at reduction. You know,
but the weird thing is that's not what net zero is. And again, I had to look it up. Vicky, do you know what net zero is?
No, I couldn't give you a definition.
Paul?
Well, now I'm scared that I'm going to get it wrong.
There's a lot of fear at this end of the table.
It's the idea that for all the emissions we're creating in 2050 in Australia, it's all abated. So if you do a plus-minus sum, you end up with zero.
Okay. Yeah. Correct, Paul.
Thank you.
Look at the relief on his face.
So much relief.
But there's a lot of confusion about that,
there
right?
Is. Oh.
And is Canavan adding to that confusion? Is he creating an impression up here that net zero promise from the coalition is a bit of nudge, nudge, wink, wink?
Yeah, with that statement, possibly, yeah. But I've heard lots of other statements that are similar. I mean, I think Australia just wants honesty from our politicians. I think they're sick and tired of this childish schoolyard battles about, you know, showing someone with a smirk on their face after this very serious comment, or someone forgot their, the party line on certain things. But look, we don't want to... I surveyed a number of people, 2 children to be honest, and I said...
See, this is in the interest of honesty.
I said to both of them, what do you think about... Oh, sick of it. Said, who do you prefer? They're both the bloody same. And what do you mean by that? Well, they tell you something and nothing happens. And they've got children, they've both got children. And I'm concerned about our grandchildren's future. And if someone should just stand up, I think Australia would applaud a politician who stood up honestly and said, listen, things aren't going real well, Flash. Let's get into it. You know, you might have to tighten your belt for a while, but I'm going to get you there. You know, someone who's honest and says,
courageous
oh,
conversation.
we just need that. and I think people would love it.
And people like Matt Canavan just need to sit down and let us out in our communities move along with our conversation and making plans instead of trying to leverage fear and uncertainty to get election outcomes. I think our communities and our situations in mining areas are being used to prop up votes for certain parties, and I think that people should be done with it. And hopefully after this election we can all agree that we don't need any more debates cast on TV and that we all just need to move along and get on with
leadership, and that was the focus, that we would get that. And I think you'd find that everybody would get behind it. We just need honesty, and let's stop this messing around, and let's stop bureaucrats making decisions about things that impact us in regional Australia.
Just before we do move on, Paul, there's a sophisticated discussion that you were facilitating today, that your audience is obviously wanting to listen to, about how we produce energy in this part of the world, what that looks like, how quick you can fire up a coal-fired power station. These are sophisticated conversations that you're having, right?
Yeah, it's complex, and it's something that I crave and I try to bring onto my radio program and try to have with the community, because there is a lot of nitty-gritty to it. There is how does renewable energy feed into the grid? What's a wholesale price? How much does that contribute to the price of your electricity bill? Our coal-fired fleet in Queensland, it's newer than New South Wales. Some of it is cleaner coal, and so the way in which it's got to ramp up and ramp down is going to be different to New South Wales. So New South Wales has lessons for Queensland, but it's not the same. And so trying to figure all that out and then net that out to, I suppose, a vote in the election is really difficult. So it's something we're trying to have that conversation.
Yes, I was fascinated that you'd go for that depth before the second cup of coffee, but there you are. The Prime Minister was also asked today about his continued support for Catherine Deves, the controversial candidate for the Sydney seat of Warringah. Ms Deves said yesterday again, remarked during an interview, that gender reassignment surgery is mutilation. And today Scott Morrison was pressed on whether he agreed with her.
What we're talking about here is gender reversal surgery for young adolescents. We can't pretend that this type of surgery is some minor procedure. This is a very significant change to a young person's life, and it is often irreversible. These are issues that I have no doubt Australians are very concerned about, as parents are very concerned about. They should be dealt with sensitively.
Can I start with you, Vicky? We just heard the Prime Minister there saying that this issue of gender reassignment surgery, which for clarity is not possible to get in this country unless you're over 18, that it's something that parents are very concerned about. Do you think they are?
Look, speaking, I guess, as a regional community member and as a GP, it's not a conversation that I'm having every day, nor every month or even every 6 months. So, you know, whilst I do have a number of transgender patients and I care for them and we walk along their journey together, I don't think this is top of the list in terms of federal election issues. And it's not at the top of people's minds in our local community. I think there's a lot of what's the word? I've lost it. But, you know, there's a lot of disinterest, I guess, in terms of some of these issues are just really not what's going on locally here for us in Rockhampton.
Yeah. Paul, I mean, or maybe Ian, politicians don't generally raise issues in an election campaign unless they're trying to get attention or get a vote. Now, one assumes that a discussion about whether or not gender reassignment surgery is mutilation is not one that's designed to win votes in inner city Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney. Is it meant to play up here?
Oh, look, I don't know. I didn't see the interview nor the reference that were made. You know, I think we're downplaying. Australia is a very tolerant and accommodating society. I just don't think it should be a discussion for election. I just think it's a personal thing that you know, people deal with, and they deal with their family, and with their GPs and their consultants. I don't think it should be aired in public at all. I just you know, if you ask everybody in the street, I think Australia, as I said earlier, they're a very tolerant, understanding, and supportive community. I think it's an ugly thing to be raised, to be honest.
Kelly? I mean, because the view is that this is, you know, when you have these sorts of issues, identity issues about, you know, what it is to be male, what it is to be female, and the whole trans issue, that somehow that's designed to attract the attention of people in regional areas.
Yeah, look, and I do think that there's strategic drivers, I think, to some of the campaigning that's happening. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was a strategic driver. I think it's really upsetting that someone would use that and try to appeal to a certain, you know, people that might be a little more conservative or a little less educated. I think it's really upsetting that this is even becoming a topic, and I do think it's strategic, and I just think that's pretty disgraceful.
Is it a conversation that takes off a little bit when people talk about women's sport, that sort of thing? Is that a conversation?
Look, that's not a conversation I'm having with people. I think that people in my area are looking to have teachers in our classrooms because we don't at the moment. You know, everyone's trying their best. We're looking at cost of living. We're wondering about, you know, permanent jobs. We want the same job and the same pay. We want to have one job, not three, to pay our bills. They're the things that I'm hearing people talk about this election, and that's just not something that's been raised.
Paul, slight tangent, but housing. Is that a bigger issue than these sorts of identity issues? Or if you opened the talkback lines, would you get an equal interest in both?
I haven't had a single call or text about the role of trans people in our community or what they do. It hasn't factored, as far as I can tell, in what we do on ABC Capricornia. But housing absolutely is.
And just, we've got 1 minute. What's the issue there?
There isn't any. You can't get a rental. You can't buy a house. House prices are going through the roof. Central Queensland's a beautiful place. I absolutely get wanting to live here. Don't mind the weather out the back. It's usually much nicer. But people with good paying jobs, double income households with good references are competing against 10, 15 other people for every house they try to get into, and end up being in their car, paying for a motel every night, whatever it might be. And it's really hurting. And it's stopping workers from moving here. Because if you employ someone to come move to a small town in central Queensland and then they can't find a place to live, and I've heard those stories, they go, sorry, I'm not taking the job anymore because I can't find a house.
So that's the issue. Before we go, this is my new question that I like to ask people. Clearly I need to get out more. What year will it be when your youngest child is your age? And I'll let you do the maths beforehand. Ian?
I've done it. 2058.
2058? In 2058, your youngest child will be your age.
My age, yep.
And what will Central Queensland look like in 2058? So that's 8 years after net zero, which we now means... I'd have to look it up again. What will the world be like?
Oh, look, I would hope that we address some of the issues we've talked about today. I just think that we do need to decentralise. I think for a healthier society for Australia, I think we need to create more work and more sustainability in regional Australia. And if Rockhampton can be part of that, or Moorooba, or anybody else, then I think it would be a healthy outcome for everybody.
A bigger regional centre here in Rocky?
Well,
can you imagine that?
Yeah, and supporting, I can, yeah. And supporting our smaller country towns that one, need employment, that they want their families to stay at home with them. They don't have to go off to be educated in southeast corner and meet someone there and decide, well, this is too good, I'm not coming back, you know. So,
Vicky?
Yeah, so my daughter will be my age in 2052, so not too much different to Ian. And look, I really hope and foresee a flourishing regional centre as well here in Rockhampton in that time. And, you know, we have some glimmers of hope. We've just got a new regional medical pathway established here in Rockhampton that's going to be a homegrown end-to-end training program for young doctors. So, you know, it's an example of the hope we have for the future, where we could have a self-sustaining community here in the regions, and I think, yeah, that's absolutely what we need and want.
And so that means that you could start your education, your post-school education here in healthcare, you could complete it here, and you could end up staying here in the region.
Absolutely, yep. So young school leavers can do all their training in the regions, and then can commence their working lives and do all the training that they need to do as part of that. And they can find partners in regional Queensland. They can, you know, stay at home and have the support networks around them with their families, and they can be part of our communities right from a young age. So,
Paul, you don't have kids, and you told us that all your jolly nieces and nephews have ever given you is, what is it, chicken pox and COVID, was it?
Yeah, gastro the other time. No, they've given me lots of beautiful hugs and joy in my life as well. I want to be clear.
That's not what you said earlier, but sure.
You've got to get me in trouble here, yeah.
Can you imagine your life still being here in 2050?
Yeah, it's an incredible place, and I think the more you build culture and things to do for young people and people in their 20s and 30s particularly as well, when they're deciding whether they want to go away somewhere else for uni or get a job somewhere else, things like the Rockhampton Museum of Art or a motorsports precinct, or, you know, things to do for people in that age range when you're still trying to figure out what your profession is, what your career is, your boyfriends, girlfriends, who are you going to marry, and if you meet them in a place where there's lots to do, then you're going to stick around. And Rockhampton's a place where there's lots of that, and I suppose the more you add that to your regional towns, the more they're going to stick around.
Just take 20 seconds to tell me about this wonderful building we're in. It is amazing.
It's incredible. Only opened a couple months ago. So Rex Pilgreen, the former mayor of Rockhampton back in the 70s, used a little loophole in an Australia Council offer to match dollar for dollar art contributions. He took them for all they were worth. And now there is some incredible artwork, so people should come to Rockhampton and see it, because there's a Sydney Nolan, there's a Ben Quilty, incredible pieces of art in this building. It's an amazing building.
Yeah, and I hate to be, you know, just ordinary and pedestrian, but there's an awesome cafe too. Kelly, how old will your youngest child be?
I feel like I need a buzzer next time. I can get a buzzer. So 2048, I think I'm at, you know, when my kids will be my age. And I'm really kind of excited about it. You know, if the people that I work with have their way, I think we'll be a centre out there for innovation, for ag tech, for, you know, mine remediation that's led by traditional owners. I think we're going to see, you know, innovation in terms of opportunities in mining sectors that'll translate to the mining of new minerals as well. I think that I see opportunity if we can get the policy settings right, and if we can get the governments to come in and get on board and get on with it. Yeah.
And you don't see that the little towns that are 5 generations old, you know, the people's lives go back there in terms of European people, having to end up coming into a place like Rockhampton. You see them flourishing?
Oh, look, you know, we always speak on the positive out where we are, because if we talk all doomsday about the reduction of services in our communities, I think we'd all give up early. You know, we'll be out there fighting for everything we can, and with communities like Claremont and communities that'll get out and solve their problems and solutions, you know, we're there to back them, and they'll back us, and I feel like, you know, there's opportunity for a better life out there too.
And you still be there, do you think?
Oh, we'll see. Never know. Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much. It's been just an absolutely wonderful conversation. The weather held for us. We thought that it was all going to come in on us.
It's usually sunnier.
Yes, yes.
It
Except
is.
we've brought some sort of cyclonic weather, haven't we?
Yes, about to get very wet here.
Very, very normal. When the drum goes on the road, we bring the weather. That is all we have time for. A big thanks to our panel, to Kelly Vivi, Ian Mill, Dr. Vicky Richmond and Paul Culliver. Julia's back with you tomorrow night. Have a wonderful evening wherever you are in this great country of ours. Good night to you.
For the latest on the federal election, go to ABC News Digital.
Policy announcements and how they impact you.
Profiles of every electorate, including yours.
Anthony Green's guide to the key seats.
You Ask, We Answer is back, and you can see what other Australians are asking.
There's our new Get Ready to Vote checklist, plus live blogs and notifications so you won't miss a thing.
For election news that matters to you, go to abc.net.au/Australia Votes or download the ABC News app.
Bikie shooting, one man dead and another fighting for life after an attack in Sydney's west. The WA Premier's admission the health system is under enormous stress as COVID infections jump to a new high. Mobility problems forced the Queen to miss the opening of Parliament for the first time in 59 years.
And coming up on the business, billions lost in the great stock market sell-off. Investors scramble as asset prices are slammed.
Good evening, Michael Tetlow with ABC Late News. A Comanchero bikie and his brother have been gunned down in a hail of bullets in Sydney's west. It happened at the Body Fit gym on Parramatta Road in Auburn earlier this evening, with one of the men dying from his injuries. Comanchero bikie Tarek Zahed and his brother Omar were the victims. One suffered up to 10 gunshot wounds to his body and head. The other was shot multiple times in the arms and legs. It's not known which of the men has died. There were also 2 car fires in nearby suburbs around the same time. It's unclear at this stage whether they were linked to the shooting. The WA Premier has warned extreme pressures on the health system will be difficult to fix, with the state's hospitals and ambulances struggling to cope with a spike in demand. The concern comes as COVID continues to spread rapidly in the state, with new case numbers passing 12,000 for the first time.
Record-breaking case numbers continue to climb, pushing the state's ambulance system to near breaking point.
We as an organisation experienced a surge in demand that we haven't experienced before.
On Monday, ambulances were ramped outside hospitals for about 330 hours, a figure close to that recorded in the entire month of April in 2017. Combined with a significant jump in 000 calls, the state's ambulance service was left to take an unprecedented step, directly warning the public of delayed response times.
What we're seeing now is the direct effect of reducing restrictions when you're on the plateau phase of a pandemic.
Among those direct effects are a significant number of hospital staff unable to work, either as positive cases or close contacts.
20% of our medical staff have been off, and that's not unusual across the board. There are wards where they're just about scraping by in terms of staffing levels. So that's the biggest factor.
Just today, we have 2,200 staff who are not at work because they are COVID positive or close contacts. That's putting enormous stress on the system.
The Premier says the government has committed to solutions, but even with another record surplus on the horizon, he acknowledges little can be done to ease the pressure now.
That's hard to avoid. It's hard to fix at this point in time.
This points to 5 years of underinvestment in our hospital system, a government which has cut corners in our capacity, and it points to a hospital system which is in crisis.
Mr McGowan was also on the defensive over a new bill being rushed through Parliament. Under changes to the Emergency Management Act, the government was given broad-ranging powers to impose health restrictions under a state of emergency in response to the pandemic. Those powers had been due to expire in July. The government now wants them available until at least January of next year.
We've had advice from the Police Commissioner, the Chief Health Officer, that it's required.
We are greatly concerned that the government have avoided a lot of scrutiny on the decisions, and this is just a way of them continuing to avoid public scrutiny of their decisions.
The Premier says the powers are only available during the state of emergency, which could end before January. Kian Burke, ABC News.
The WA government is offering subsidies for people to buy electric and hydrogen cars to try to reduce transport emissions. But there's a sting in the tail. Owners will also have to pay a new tax to use roads.
Prices are falling, but electric cars are still well out of reach for most people. Now the WA government is offering a helping hand.
If you buy an electric vehicle under the value of $70,000, you will get a $3,500 rebate. There'll be 10,000 of those available.
The pre-budget announcement is part of a $60 million clean energy car fund that includes money to help local councils and small business build more charging stations throughout the state, including across the Nullarbor.
We'll have the longest continuous opportunity to charge an electric vehicle of anywhere in the world.
Early adopters welcome the measures but say supply may be the issue.
Right now, demand for EVs is insatiable, and I'm not sure that any measure would really change that. The supply of EVs globally is very tight right now.
There's also a catch. From mid-2027, electric and hybrid vehicle owners will be taxed to use Western Australia's roads. EV owners will pay 2.5 cents per kilometre. For the average Perth driver, it'll cost about $275 a year. Hybrid drivers will pay slightly less at 2 cents per kilometre. While some EV drivers support the charge, others believe it's unfair.
I think singling out EV drivers when they've already paid a substantial chunk of tax, both in GST and stamp duty, it's not like we're freeloading, you know, it's not like we haven't paid our taxes.
But the government says the new charge reflects what other states are doing and will be needed to maintain the roads, given EV drivers don't pay the fuel excise.
A typical year's driving, paying a user charge for an electric vehicle would be approximately half the costs that people are paying currently in excise. So it is still a massive saving.
Also a saving for the planet, with transport Australia's third largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. Claire Moody, ABC News.
Anthony Albanese has taken the unusual step of backing a big rise to the minimum wage, saying he doesn't want workers going backwards. The coalition's been quick to warn an increase on that scale could trigger higher inflation and force the Reserve Bank to lift rates faster and harder. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
They have some of the most important jobs, but these aged care workers are among the lowest paid. Just $22 an hour, little more than $1 over the minimum wage.
I believe the minimum wage should at least keep up with the cost of living.
Anthony Albanese's put wages at the centre of his election campaign. Today, he put a number on it.
You don't want people to go backwards. Does that mean you would support a wage hike of at least 5.1% just to keep up with inflation?
Absolutely.
No Australian government or opposition has ever put a figure on the rate of the annual wage increase. And yet Mr Albanese today has done just that.
Mr Albanese, you said wages absolutely...
Although Labor later insisted it would not put a specific number in any formal submission to the industrial umpire on the minimum wage.
Thank you. Thank you.
What's controversial about wages keeping up with the cost of living?
Has Anthony Albanese considered whether this decision will have inflationary impacts?
Inflation, currently just over 5%, is expected to peak at 6% by year's end. Unions demanding a 5.5% rise for more than 2 million Australians on award wages.
Any increase less than 5.1% is a real wage cut.
Higher costs
have to be passed through into prices.
Whether he intended it or not, Anthony Albanese has effectively declared 5.1% a fair wage rise for the lowest paid workers. It will have popular appeal, but given economists and the business community warn it would also drive up inflation and interest rates even faster, expect Scott Morrison to refocus on the Labor leader's economic credentials. Then again, the PM's own personal investments are proving to have a poor return. His captain's pick candidate, Catherine Deeves, effectively withdrawing her apology for calling gender reassignment surgery mutilation.
That was inappropriate.
Look, that is actually the correct medico-legal term.
This is a significant surgical procedure that completely changes someone's life, and it should never be entered into lightly.
You have implied that young people 18 and over enter into a fundamentally life-changing surgery lightly.
You're implying that. I'm not implying that.
A culture war that harms the vulnerable few, and for what? A candidate with little chance of winning. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
And ABC political experts Anthony Green, Patricia Karvelis and Andrew Probyn will be answering your questions about the election live tomorrow on the ABC News website from noon Eastern Time. Northern Territory Chief Minister Michael Gunner has resigned, saying he wants to spend more time with his family. The Labor leader made the shock announcement in Parliament after handing down the NT's latest budget. He said it had been a tough 2 years leading the Territory through the pandemic after suffering a heart attack in January 2020.
The birth of our second child the week before last confirmed something for me. My head and my heart are no longer here. They are at home.
Deputy Chief Minister Nicole Manison will lead the Territory until a new Chief Minister is chosen by the caucus. Prince Charles has taken centre stage at the opening of Britain's Parliament, replacing his mother, Queen Elizabeth. The 96-year-old missed the event for the first time in almost 6 decades because of mobility issues.
In these challenging times, Her Majesty's government will play a leading role in defending democracy and freedom across the world, including continuing to support the people of Ukraine. Members of the House of Commons, estimates for the public services will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, other measures will be laid before you. Her Majesty prays that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your councils.
Authorities in Sri Lanka are bracing for more violence despite the resignation of Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa. The country's worst economic crisis in decades has sparked weeks of unrest, with pro- and anti-government protesters clashing for the first time. The homes of politicians have been set alight, buses have been toppled and cars pushed into the water. A state of emergency and a nationwide curfew has failed to stop the demonstrators. They're vowing to continue until the President and brother of the outgoing Prime Minister also resigns. A silkscreen portrait of Marilyn Monroe by pop artist Andy Warhol has sold at auction for more than $280 million. Shot Sage Blue Marilyn is one in a series of works made of the actress after her death in 1962. Tension was high in the New York bidding room before the hammer came down. The sale price was a little lower than expected, but still broke the previous record for an American artwork at auction, set in 2017. Eagles defender Liam Duggan says the mood within the club remains positive and insists they can shock the football world by upsetting the rampant Melbourne. West Coast is on the bottom of the ladder after a disastrous start to the season and hosts the undefeated Demons on Sunday.
When you're going as badly as the Eagles, virtually everyone gets questioned, even their premiership coach.
I don't think he is the man to rebuild this club because of the tenure that he's been there for and how long it is going to take, and there's not a lot coming through.
Not only have on-field performances been poor, West Coast's off-field standards have been criticised after 7 players were fined for going to a nightclub, all while COVID and injuries have the Eagles struggling to field a side.
Those boys will cop their punishments, but we've got to move on now, and obviously we're disappointed, but they're still our mates and our teammates, and we need the best out of them.
West Coast's average losing margin across the past 4 games has been a whopping 83 points, leaving many fearing the worst in Sunday's clash with the rampaging Melbourne.
I do like being the underdog a little bit. I think that's maybe a defender's trait, but yeah, it's certainly a massive challenge for us to beat the D's, but I'm confident that we can do it.
In contrast, the praise keeps coming at the Dockers, with Heath Chapman this week's Rising Star nominee.
Chapman, so evasive.
And he's put his start to the year down to a solid pre-season after missing much of 2021 through injury.
Chapman with another intercept for Freo.
Was able to take some good learnings out of that, and prepare my body a little bit better for the level, and now I don't take games for granted, and try to do my best each week.
But the news isn't so good for Fremantle's women's side, with 2-time All-Australian forward Gemma Houghton leaving the club to join Port Adelaide. Blake Kagi, ABC News.
Rain developing in Perth tomorrow with a top of 22 degrees. Rain as well for Brisbane, a few showers in Sydney and Canberra. Becoming cloudy for Melbourne, Hobart and Adelaide. And that is ABC Late News 2. The moment, I'm Michael Tetlow. Stay with us for the business.
Welcome to The Business. I'm Catherine Robinson. Coming up on the program, big issues in the Apple aisle. What Tasmanian enterprise wants from the next government.
It's cheaper for someone to get a container from Melbourne to Singapore than to get from Launceston to Melbourne.
Now we have the issue of the shortage of labour and skills.
And billions lost in the great stock market sell-off. Investors scramble as asset prices are slammed.
I don't think it's panic stations. I think you're getting set up for a good buying opportunity in the back half of this year. But there's a little bit of pain to go through.
Well, during this election campaign, the Tasmanian marginal seats of Bass and Braddon have been top destinations for the major parties. In these key battlegrounds, business leaders are calling for migration policies and training to help ease skills shortages, as well as subsidies to get more tourists to the island state. Here's Rihanna Whitson.
In the northern Tasmanian electorate of Bass, natural wonders make tourism a big employer here.
Because it's such a culturally significant area for our people.
But for this Indigenous cultural tours operator, bookings have been slow since the state reopened its border. As the cost of living rises, Greg Murray is worried things will get worse.
We have what they want to see, but they've got to be able to get here, and it's got to represent good value for money.
Businesses want free car travel on the ferry to Tasmania extended. They're also lobbying for guaranteed funding to reduce freight costs.
Bass Strait is one of the most expensive bodies of water in the world because it's such a short run. So again, it's cheaper for someone to get a container from Melbourne to Singapore than to get from Launceston to Melbourne.
Launceston is where the majority of Bass voters live. It's the most marginal Liberal seat in the country.
Bass has been described as the nation's ejector seat, and that's because at 8 of the last 10 federal elections, it's changed party status. Now, with that sort of history, it's used to being the centre of attention.
For publican Grace Robbins, finding staff and the environment are among her top concerns.
Tourism in Tasmania is vital to businesses like this. We also sell a lot of local Tasmanian produce that are all going to be affected by climate change.
The seat of Bass is held by Liberal Bridget Archer on a margin of 0.4%. In the last parliament, she raised her profile by crossing the floor on issues including the Federal Integrity Commission. But even a small swing against the coalition could see the former MP Labor's Ross Hart re-elected.
And these are 100% manufactured here in this factory of
While local manufacturing is booming, companies want the major parties to do more to help them find and train staff.
Every business we represent now employs more people than they did 2-3 years ago, which is great for the region, and hence now we have the issue of the shortage of labour and skills.
Lee Darcy represents big companies like Rio Tinto and GFG Alliance, which both operate smelters in Bass, as well as smaller players like Temtrol.
The universities don't have the international students here to be trained that we normally then attract and keep them here. So whatever can be done to really get students back into the country to start with would be a great start, and then to actually allow that migration would certainly help.
In the neighbouring electorate of Braddon, workers are also in short supply.
We've probably got about 30 vacancies, that's about probably 10%.
The Renison tin mine is one of the largest of its kind in Australia. And with northwest Tasmania on the cusp of another mining boom, job vacancies will grow.
There'll be a competition internally between the mines on the west coast here itself.
The volatile seat of Braddon has a mix of agricultural districts in the north, mining and wilderness areas in the west. It was won by Liberal Gavin Pearce in 2019 with a margin of 3.1%. He faces a challenge from new Labor candidate Chris Lynch. Votes against the major parties are expected to rise. In a tight race, preference flows will be crucial. In this seat, community leaders say there is a dire shortage of housing, and it's contributing to the labour shortage.
There is 2 jobs for every person on the west coast at the moment.
The council here is part of a national lobby group calling for tax breaks for people to build more homes in mining communities.
The 50% fringe benefits that government offer to people to build housing, they want to increase that to 100% so that the people that come into the community want to build houses.
Another sector under pressure from labour and housing shortages is forestry.
One industry player told me that even finding an extra 10 workers to help the business expand would be difficult.
An hour's drive away in Smithton, Tarkine Fresh Oysters is looking to expand, but finding workers is also tough.
Labor's obviously going to go up with inflation. I see a larger wage rise coming this year from Fair Work. We'll have to look at putting our price up as well. So we bring oysters in here.
Josh Polk is reluctant to say which political party he's backing.
From my point of view, I think either side of politics will support our industry. I certainly hope so.
The time to convince voters is running out.
Rihanna Whitson there. The freefall on global stock markets is continuing, with Wall Street tumbling to its lowest point in more than a year. The S&P 500 is off 17% this year, the Nasdaq even worse. Tech stocks down more than 25% since January. Today, Australian shares wiped off $20 billion in value as investors worry about rising rates, inflation and the possibility of a global recession. But we've been here before. The 1987 stock market crash was set against a backdrop of soaring rates and inflation. So, what lessons were learned then, and could they apply now? Centennial's Matthew Kidman says investors are facing a showbag of concerns, with one standout.
Investors in general are most concerned about inflation, which is global, but mainly the problem sits in the US and Europe, where most of the investment markets or the majority of the money sits. And they're just wondering how long inflation stays elevated. As we've seen over the last few months, inflation has really kicked up for a number of reasons. Strong demand, but also because of supply problems around the world with supply lines, wars and so on. So that's what they're trying to work out, because once you can get a grip on when inflation comes down, you can get a grip on interest rates, which determine valuations in markets.
With respect to share markets, I mean, how far do you think this sell-off can go? And looking more broadly, do you think all asset classes are going to be hit?
Well, it's been very interesting because the actual sell-off probably started in August last year. And as we know, the high-flying tech sector, and particularly in the US, and we see that in the Nasdaq index, has been down for a while now, and it's down about 26% from its top. So it's had a fairly big correction. And that was all about valuations, company valuations, very high valuations that needed to be reeled in because higher interest rates mean you discount those asset values back more aggressively. But more recently, it's bled into another story, which is, does the US and the rest of the world effectively have to go into recession to kill off inflation, which is the enemy of asset prices around the world? And that's where we've headed now. So other places which have done quite well, including the Australian share market, which is only down about 7 or 8%, dominated by banks, dominated by mining companies, they're starting to suffer a bit now because if a recession does come, that's not good for them.
Well, theories abound around that, recession or not. One is that we're heading for a crash. Another is that everything will just stagnate. Some are even calling for an era of prosperity. What are you forecasting?
Well, I think a crash is I shouldn't say this with too much surety because it might come, but I don't think we've got a crash in our hands. I think we've had a pretty orderly decline in asset prices as interest rates have gone up. So it's not a surprise. On individual days like yesterday and today, it does speed up a bit and it does cause a bit of anxiety. But generally, asset prices, the equity market prices have declined fairly orderly. Now, as I said, what happens in the future is always a guess. But it's all around what happens with inflation. Now, if we get some early signs, the next couple of inflation data points out of the US show that inflation may have peaked, then you'll get the bond market, the interest rate market starting to level off, and that could actually be quite good for equity markets again, where they think, well, we know where interest rates are heading. Now, that is a maybe, and that'll be over the next couple of months. We get an inflation figure out of the US this week. That's the first sign, and maybe one, a month later. And if those two are fairly benign, equity prices might find a bottom fairly quickly. Conversely, as I said, I've outlined how much markets have fallen. The Nasdaq's taken the brunt of it, down 26%. The S&P 500 in the US down 16 or 17%. But the Aussie market, which is dominated by commodity-based stocks, only down 7 or 8%. So if inflation persists and they have to jack those rates up higher and higher and does go into recession, you're looking at a market that can continue to grind its way down, I would think, into the back end of this year.
Investors have been here before, haven't they, Matthew? Because when you look at the similarities from the 1987 crash, what lessons really, if any, are applicable from there for now?
Yeah, look, 87 was interesting. It was a little bit before my time, but going back and putting on my history hat, there was a lot of leverage in the market. When I say leverage, people were borrowing a lot of money to get into a rising stock market, and it happens. This time around, slightly different. There's not, well, not in the domestic economy, there's not a lot of leverage, but where the excesses were in that tech sector fundamentally. Not exclusively, but growth and tech. And that is coming out at a fairly rapid rate, as we've seen. Even in Australia, we're not dominated by tech stocks, but the smaller component of the tech industry has seen stocks like a realestate.com or a WiseTech and these bigger tech-enabled stocks down 40, 50%. So they haven't escaped it. It just hasn't dominated our index. So I don't think we're going to get a crash, but this orderly decline, this bear market that's evolving, we might only be halfway through it in the declines, as I said, if they can't get on top of inflation. So I don't think it's panic stations. I think you're getting set up for a good buying opportunity in the back half of this year. But there's a little bit of pain to go through. And I think other asset classes, whether it be property, residential, where a lot of Australians are in, and so on, they're probably going to go through the same situation. It's just that you don't see the prices day to day like you do in the share market, which, as I said, can cause a bit of anxiety. I don't think we're at that anxious stage.
Matthew Kidman, thank you.
Thanks very much.
To markets now, and the All Ordinaries and the ASX 200 paring back some early losses to end nearly 1% lower, and the Aussie dollar is buying a bit under 70 US cents. Marcus Padley from Marcus Today joined me after the market closed. Marcus, another rough day in the markets. That's 4 straight weeks of losses. What's upset them today?
Well, the traditional fears have been interest rates, inflation, the Russian situation. And on the back of that, our market's been outperforming, and really it's been a big tech sell-off as people fear higher interest rates impacting valuations on stocks. But in the last week or so, this has rotated into fears about slower growth driven by Chinese lockdowns and also driven by this more aggressive rate hike timetable from the Fed. And on the back of that, you've seen a new sort of leg down, which has included resources. Resources are now 16% off the top. Commodity prices, there's a CRB index. It's doubled since the pandemic. It's just come 13% off the top. So the new development in the last week or two has been resources coming off the top, as well as high PE growth, hot stocks, high conviction stocks.
Okay, so how are those growth fears manifesting themselves in our market?
Well, as I say, resources are coming down. Today, we saw even the energy stocks fall over. That's been one of the outperforming sectors in this recent fall. And the oil price was down 6% overnight. The Saudis have dropped prices for the first time. And what's happened in energy is that Europe has weakened a bit or softened Russian sanctions. So even now the energy complex coming off the top, and the iron ore price was down 4% on the back of Chinese growth concerns. So it is, as I say, just resources have started to come off the top, and that sector's held us up. The amazing thing is that our market's only down about 7-8% or so from the top, whereas the US market is down 20, the NASDAQ 30, and our bank sector's only down 4.3%. Obviously, they've just had results and have dividends coming up. So they've held up very well, which has meant our market's outperformed.
Marcus Padley, great to talk. Thank you.
My pleasure, Beth.
And that's all from The Business. For more on those stories, head to the ABC News website and you can catch the program anytime on iView. I'm Catherine Robinson. See you next time.
The following program contains coarse language.
Hi, my name's Brian Johnson of AC/DC. And tonight's program is about one of rock music's most iconic figures. My predecessor in the band, the late, great Bon Scott. There's a lot being written about the colourful life and the tragic death of Bon. And tonight, we're going to hear from Bon's family for the first time in 40 years, and others who haven't spoken publicly in decades. Tonight, this is his Australian story.
The first time in his life that he had, he'd actually felt he was accomplishing something. He got to be who he wanted to be.
And the more we work, the more we tour, we're getting more ideas and we're getting more, it's going to get better and better. I can't see an end to it, It's like infinity rock and roll.
Over the years, there's been all sorts of theories and beliefs of what really happened to Bon. The band were in London. Malcolm and Angus were in the studio, putting some rough ideas down for the next album. But Bon wasn't required at that point, so he sort of had some time to himself.
My understanding is that he went out and met up with friends and drank way too much. And he came back with a friend.
Alistair drove Bon back to Bon's place, but Bon had passed out on the way. He couldn't lift him, so he thought, well, I'll take him back to my place, which he did. Bon was sound asleep, and Alistair went upstairs and made Bon as comfortable as he could in the car.
They came down apparently and threw a blanket over him so he wouldn't be cold, and then the rest is history, that he died the next morning.
The coroner found that Bon had died of acute alcohol poisoning and death by misadventure. Bon passing as he did, on his own in a car in the freezing cold, after all his hard work and all his heartbreak getting there, was just an incredibly sad, lonely and unglamorous way to go out.
It was just something that shouldn't have happened, and it did happen. Tragically happened.
I hate to say this, but unfortunately when Ron died, and I heard the circumstances, I wasn't surprised.
33-1.
That pattern of getting bored and restless. If he was only away from the studio for a few days in London, his boredom that he faced here, for him, that was excruciating. He drank far, far too much. I did wonder if he would push it too far one day, and sadly, he obviously did.
I think Bruce pretty well got it right. I really do. Because boredom was a big thing. That was his biggest problem. I think when he got bored, he drank.
It was a terrible time for the band. They were devastated and didn't know whether to continue or not. But it was Bon's parents that were very much behind. You know, they said Bon would never have wanted them to stop.
So we decided we'd go ahead, you know.
Yeah.
And I always remembered Bon telling us how good a vocalist Brian was.
As soon as they started playing and I was singing with them and everything, my hairs were standing on end, and you know, it was fantastic. It was wonderful. I'd never sang with a band this good.
With Brian Johnson and the Back in Black album, AC/DC just really, really took off. And to this day, decades on, they're still the biggest rock act in the world. Which was bittersweet because it was where Bon was going to be.
Thousands upon thousands of Akadaka fans have come down here to Fremantle to pay tribute to the band and the former frontman, Bon Scott.
The thing about Bon Scott is that as time has gone by, his legend has become bigger.
He is now considered by millions of people around the world the rock and roll singer, the rock and roll frontman.
There's an astounding global legacy that he's left all these years later. Those songs just live on.
The stories have grown, haven't they? 42 years later, people want to know more about him than ever, and it's hard to believe. It really is hard to believe. You know, I wish he was here to know that he'd made it. He really did make it. Ron would have been 75. If Ron could see what was happening in the world today over himself, I think he'd have a good laugh. He really would. He'd be surprised, but he'd have a good laugh and a drink.
It certainly inspired me. I think that's what he was more than anything to me, an inspiration. Even when I hear him talking in old interviews, I still laugh. Even if I've seen it 20 times, I still laugh and chuckle along with him. And he was a special guy. He really was. I wish I had got to know him more, but I didn't. Yeah, that's life.
A Comanchero bikie and his brother gunned down in a hail of bullets outside a Western Sydney gym. The Labor leader backs a big rise in the minimum wage as thousands of aged care workers walk off the job. A landslide presidential win in the Philippines for the son of a former dictator. And the Queen misses the opening of Parliament for the first time in 59 years. Hello, Michael Tetlow with ABC Late News. A Comanchero bikie and his brother have been gunned down in a hail of bullets in Sydney's west. Tarek Zahed and his brother Omar were shot outside the Body Fit gym on Parramatta Road in Auburn earlier in the evening. The ABC understands Omar Zahed died at the scene after going into cardiac arrest. Tarek Zahed was shot up to 10 times but police say he remained conscious and breathing when taken to hospital. He remains in a critical condition. There were also 2 car fires in nearby suburbs around the same time as the shooting. It's unclear at this stage whether the incidents were linked. Anthony Albanese has taken the unusual step of backing a big rise to the minimum wage, saying he doesn't want workers going backwards. The coalition's been quick to warn an increase on that scale could trigger higher inflation and force the Reserve Bank to lift rates faster and harder. Here's political editor Andrew Probin.
They have some of the most important jobs, but these aged care workers are among the lowest paid. Just $22 an hour, little more than $1 over the minimum wage.
I believe the minimum wage should at least keep up with the cost of living.
Anthony Albanese's put wages at the centre of his election campaign. Today, he put a number on it.
You don't want people to go backwards. Does that mean you would support a wage hike of at least 5.1% just to keep up with inflation?
Absolutely.
No Australian government or opposition has ever put a figure on the rate of the annual wage increase. And yet Mr Albanese today has done just that.
Mr Albanese, you said wages absolutely...
Although Labor later insisted it would not put a specific number in any formal submission to the industrial umpire on the minimum wage.
Thank you. Thank you.
What's controversial about wages keeping up with the cost of living?
Has Anthony Albanese considered whether this decision will have inflationary impacts?
Inflation, currently just over 5%, is expected to peak at 6% by year's end. Unions demanding a 5.5% rise for more than 2 million Australians on award wages.
Any increase less than 5.1% is a real wage cut.
Higher costs have to be passed through into prices.
Whether he intended it or not, Anthony Albanese has effectively declared 5.1% a fair wage rise for the lowest paid workers. It will have popular appeal, but given economists and the business community warn it would also drive up inflation and interest rates even faster, expect Scott Morrison to refocus on the Labor leader's economic credentials. Then again, the PM's own personal investments are proving to have a poor return. His captain's pick candidate, Catherine Deeves, effectively withdrawing her apology for calling gender reassignment surgery mutilation.
That was inappropriate.
Look, that is actually the correct medico-legal term.
This is a significant surgical procedure that completely changes someone's life, and it should never be entered into lightly.
You have implied that young people 18 and over enter into a fundamentally life-changing surgery lightly.
You're implying that. I'm not implying that.
A culture war that harms the vulnerable few, and for what? A candidate with little chance of winning. Andrew Probin, ABC News, Canberra.
As households struggle with the cost of living, the dental divide continues to widen, particularly among older Australians. A quarter of over 75s have untreated tooth decay, while many have no teeth at all. As political reporter Stephanie Dalzell explains, pressure's building on the major parties to commit more to dentistry, especially in aged care.
A smile is about much more than how you look. It's also a marker of wealth.
It'd be nice to be able to smile and without having to worry about showing where your teeth are decayed.
Michael Powell desperately needs dentures, but at 62, he's facing an 8-year wait in the public system.
Your self-esteem is at all-time low, and it doesn't help with your anxiety or even depression.
The gap in treatment is most obvious among older Australians, particularly those in aged care.
We have stories of patients in aged care facilities with almost no teeth left, with abscesses, pus, bleeding and discomfort to a level where they cannot eat. This is unacceptable in a country like ours.
The Australian Dental Association's calling on the major parties to commit to a senior benefits program, which would fund basic dental in aged care facilities, train staff to help with dental care, and include oral assessments in the over 75 health check performed by GPs. At $95 million a year, it's a modest policy, but it's a first step. For decades, there's been a push to include dental in Medicare, but at a cost of billions of dollars a year. Neither side has been willing to commit. Federal Labor says it's part of its long-term goal, while the coalition argues it gives money to the states to help run public dental clinics. But not committing more money also comes at a cost.
We see higher risks for diabetes or cardiovascular issues if people don't address their oral health care needs.
The Greens have again promised universal access to free dental care,
I might be leaning that way just to get my teeth fixed.
proving expensive policies can be palatable for some. Stephanie Dalzell, ABC News, Canberra.
And ABC political experts Anthony Green, Patricia Karvelis and Andrew Probyn will be answering your questions about the election live on the ABC News website from noon Eastern Time. The US President says he's worried Vladimir Putin has no way out of the war in Ukraine. Russia has launched more missile attacks on the southern port city of Odessa, and its troops are storming the last Ukrainian holdouts in the steelworks in Mariupol. Europe correspondent Nick Dole reports from the capital, Kiev.
As the streets of Moscow filled with flags, Russians marched, as they do each year, to honour the millions who died in the Second World War. Polls suggest about a third of Russia's youth don't support the war, but still, many more believe the message of their leader.
No enemy will break us. We are the country that won't bow before anybody.
There are only a few dissenting voices here.
I feel very sorry for the civilians who are suffering in Ukraine, the children, the old people. They're suffering for nothing now.
Millions of Russians have fled the country. This Moscow couple is now living in London.
We struggle with Russians' disbelief in it. It's just horrifying. It's like a country of zombies.
In Moscow, there were some protests during Victory Day. This sign saying no to the new war was quickly removed. And as millions were watching the spectacle on television, a hack on Russian smart TV sets showed a message saying the blood of thousands of Ukrainian children is on your hands. Protesters threw red paint at the Russian ambassador in Poland as he tried to lay a wreath in a Soviet military cemetery. The Kremlin was furious and launched an official complaint. There's no pause in the fighting. Russian missiles struck the southern port city of Odessa. 5 buildings were destroyed, including a shopping centre. The military parade in Moscow wasn't the only display of Russia's military assets. Ukraine's government was all too happy to put these on show. Here in Kiev, some of the burnt-out Russian hardware has been dragged into the city as a kind of trophy for Ukraine's military wins. This war isn't even close to being over, but people here are hoping this is the only kind of Russian tank they ever see again. In Mariupol, occupied by Russian forces everywhere except the Azovstal steel plant, a Victory Day parade was held on one of the few streets that haven't been destroyed. A carefully planned display to show the world Russia is in control there. Nick Dole, ABC News, Kiev.
Prince Charles has taken centre stage at the opening of Britain's Parliament, replacing his mother, Queen Elizabeth. The 96-year-old missed the event for the first time in almost 6 decades because of mobility issues. The Prince of Wales read out the government's legislative agenda, which ranged from domestic issues like cost of living and border protection to international matters, including the war in Ukraine.
In these challenging times, Her Majesty's government will play a leading role in defending democracy and freedom across the world, including continuing to support the people of Ukraine. Members of the House of Commons, estimates for the public services will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, other measures will be laid before you. Her Majesty prays that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your councils.
Voters in the Philippines have returned the Marcos family to power. Just over 3 decades ago, a popular revolution overthrew the corrupt regime of dictator Ferdinand Marcos. But tonight, his son Bongbong Marcos Jr. is heading for a landslide win in the country's presidential election. East Asia correspondent Bill Birtles reports from Manila.
Celebrating victory and the return of the Marcos dynasty. As unofficial results came through, supporters at Bongbong headquarters partied.
After we vote, we go here to support and wait for the result, and now we won!
More than 30 million Filipinos cast votes for the senator, more than twice that of his closest rival. But with the results still to be confirmed, Mr. Marcos held off declaring victory.
I want to thank you for all that you have done for us. There are thousands of you out there, volunteers, parallel groups, political leaders that have cast their lot with us.
Despite problems with voting machines in multiple districts, the results mirror what the polls predicted.
It is clear that the thoughts of the people are becoming known.
But some are concerned about the Marcos family's legacy and its brazen corruption.
The sentiment of the majority, if they are siding with Marcos Jr., it just represents that the systems have failed us.
We think the next 6 years will be riled by corruption, by a lot of economic downturns.
Bongbong Marcos's victory comes after a years-long effort to rewrite history and portray his father's 21-year rule as a golden age for the country. Experts say Bongbong's plans are far from clear.
Many of the people are speculating and have no access to direct information from the campaign about what he would do in the next 6 years.
Observers say one thing that is likely is Bongbong Marcos moving the Philippines closer to China. The US backed his father's dictatorship, but pulled support when the regime began to crumble. Some believe bitter memories for the son of the dictator may shape his views towards Washington. Bill Birtles, ABC News, Manila.
If Australians receiving benefits are found to be part of a couple, support payments can decline or even disappear under the partner income test. But there are calls for more flexibility in the system, despite the government saying there are no plans for changes. Social Affairs correspondent Norman Hermont reports.
Just before the pandemic started, Meg Honor and Andy McIntyre moved in together near Maitland, 2 hours from Adelaide. The timing couldn't have been worse.
It was tough. We didn't know where our income was coming from.
Andy started receiving the disability support pension in 2013, unable to work due to complications from a heart operation. But after coupling up, Meg's wages as a freelance art director put them over the fortnightly income test limit.
They were pretty adamant that that was the end of Andy's DSP.
Then, Meg's income dropped to just $22,000 in the last financial year.
Do you ever think you would just be better off both being on your own financially?
Well, we said we're better off apart. And we didn't want to lie to Centrelink.
Under Centrelink rules, if someone is considered to be part of a couple, their partner's income is included when it comes to determining their benefits. At the peak of COVID, the test was relaxed for many support payments, temporarily. Advocates say that should be made permanent.
Absolutely. We should look at, once again, extending support by relaxing the income test.
A spokesperson for Minister for Families and Social Services, Anne Ruston, said the government will not be making any changes. Means testing arrangements are in place to make sure that the system is fair for both the people who rely on it, but also for those who pay for it, the taxpayers. Meg and Andy say they're struggling to pay the bills for his medicine and have this plea.
Have some sort of flexibility to those that are on the borderline.
They want to fare the same as a couple as they would living apart. Norman Hermont, ABC News.
The Tasmania Jack Jumpers have arrived in Sydney for Game 3 of the NBL Finals Grand Final Series. The Kings are leading the best of 5 series 2-0.
Public enemy number one in Tasmania, Chase Buford, the Kings coach, now infamous for this kick.
Chase Buford is headless.
No suspension though from the NBL, just a $375 fine for the blatant act of aggression on Sunday.
Obviously I'll be paying for the board, a little fine on top of it, but I've got to figure out a way to control my emotions.
Buford's Kings eventually prevailed in Game 2 via this game winner from DJ Vasiljevic.
DJ Vasiljevic, a dagger!
Tasmanian fans incensed, so much so Vasiljevic says he received a death threat via social media.
Just a bunch of keyboard warriors, I think, that can, they be tough behind the screen.
The Kings confirmed today they're pursuing the matter with Basketball Australia.
We'll definitely be looking into it and making sure that doesn't continue.
It's inexcusable in sports. We're here to entertain. These are young guys playing their hearts out.
Kings co-owner Paul Smith further antagonised Jack Jumpers fans, saying those hoping for a Cinderella story should acknowledge superior talent. The Jack Jumpers believe the series is closer than it seems.
We're gaining momentum again. It would have been good to get Game 2, but, as you can see, we're right there.
As for Sydney's injured MVP, Jalen Adams, he trained today and will be a game-time decision.
I wasn't expecting him to do as much just now as he did, so the coaching staff was pleased to see how he's moving out there.
A Sydney win tomorrow night will mean a first championship in 16 years for the Kings. If Tasmania prevails, it'll be back to Hobart for Game 4 on Friday. Chris Rowbottom, ABC News.
To the A-League, and Melbourne City have been crowned premiers for the second year in a row. It follows a 2-1 win over Wellington Phoenix at home. Socceroos striker Jamie McLaren made it 2-0 inside 10 minutes to secure his fourth Golden Boot crown. A Wellington goal in the second half made for a nervy finish, but City held on to secure the Premier's plate.
Scott Jamieson holding some silverware aloft for the second season in a row.
City now has the first week of the finals free until the semi-finals. Let's go to the weather now. Here's Paul Higgins.
More heavy rain for Queensland. Those heaviest falls will move east to be over the central coast tomorrow. Less intense rain over New South Wales and northern Victoria, the far east of South Australia and eventually Tasmania. Tomorrow night rain will also move into the west with some good falls expected in the southwest as a cold front links up with the tropical moisture. Far western Queensland will be dry but showers and storms elsewhere. Heavy falls on the coast between around Ingham and Mackay. Moderate to heavy falls in the southeast, 35 to 60 millimetres for Brisbane. Rain across the northern inland of New South Wales, spreading to the central inland during the day. A few showers along the coast. In Sydney, a few showers, afternoon showers for Canberra. Morning fog patches in southern Victoria, cloud increasing during the day, and there'll be these afternoon showers in the north, becoming cloudy in Melbourne. Dry in Tasmania, apart from a few showers in the north from early afternoon, mostly over elevated areas. In Hobart, it'll be partly cloudy. For South Australia, possible showers over and east of the Flinders and Mount Lofty ranges, and also over the northeast pastoral district and the Riverland, some late showers for Adelaide. In the west, showers developing over the southwest land division and over the far southwest Gascoyne. Perth will have late showers. Dry and sunny in the north and across most of the territory, but there is a chance of showers and storms over the top end and northeast Arnhem. In Darwin, partly cloudy.
Good on you, Paul. Thank you. And that is ABC Late News to the moment. For more at any time, you can go to our website. I'm Michael Tetlow. Thanks for your company. Take care. Bye for now.
To boost economic growth. Live performance.
A big great role model.
His family had never lost hope.
Contains the genetic material.
Welcome to the program. Businesses devastated by the Lismore floods earlier this year say they've yet to see much of the promised financial help. The first record-breaking flood swept through the northern New South Wales regional city 10 weeks ago. Some Lismore businesses say the New South Wales government is taking too long to approve disaster funding assistance, leaving many of them in limbo. Peter McCutcheon reports.
I'm not getting any sleep.
completely and utterly stressed about, well, I'm trying to make decisions.
Kristen Gardner's Lismore sawmilling business is barely surviving. 10 weeks ago, the floodwaters came well over the roof of this workshop, destroying all of his paperwork, computers, and damaging much of his valuable machinery.
So financially, how precarious is your situation?
The bills I have right now today are larger than what I've got in the bank.
It's the sort of business that's eligible for a New South Wales government scheme for grants of up to $50,000. Kristen Gardner applied for the funding 6 weeks ago, and when 7:30 spoke to him, he was still being left in the dark.
And that's all I'm asking. I was saying, tell me, yes or no. Just don't tell me nothing. I can't do anything with nothing.
How many businesses do you think are in that position?
A significant number. We're 3 months in, and I don't know any business that would have cash in the bank that will sustain them.
The floodwaters that swept across the Northern Rivers region in late February broke all records.
We will get through this. We will get the housing, we will get the cleanup completed, and we will get every single community and every single person back on their feet as quickly as possible.
Here in the city of Lismore, the cleanup has barely begun. Although most of the rubbish has been cleaned away, the central business district is still street after street of closed and boarded up shops with just a little bit of construction work. But it really is just a shell of its former self.
Let's say just in the CBD alone, there would be 1,000 businesses at least, so maybe 50 of those would be operating again.
Ellen Cronin saved some of the goods from her retail business in town, and the shopping arcade building she was based in is still damaged. She's had first-hand experience about how long it takes to receive government assistance. She's also the president of the local Chamber of Commerce, an organisation that did secure some funding after a wait of 8 weeks.
So you found the whole process overly bureaucratic?
Very frustrating, yes. And asking for a lot of information that really can be verified in other ways.
Hey, Chris, how are you?
Mary, I'm well, thanks.
For Kristen Gardner, whose business is just out of town, these delays are really starting to hurt. He's back trading but can't ramp up to pre-flood production without knowing his financial options.
I can't operate day to day. I actually need to make decisions in advance of things happening, and I can't ask them to repair something that I can't pay for with no ETA of when it could be done.
This horizontal bandsaw is the backbone of the milling business, and it's in need of urgent repair.
It's now twisted. The chassis has to be rebuilt. The electrics have been under the flood twice now. They need to be rebuilt as well.
Government has to plan that extraordinary events are going to happen. In a normal event, our hand isn't out. Extraordinary, please.
Kristen Gardner's neighbour, Stephen Barnier, lost much of his stock in his herbal and tea business and has recently applied for the same small business assistance grant.
The bureaucrats, it's out of their league, a lot of them. They're just used to shuffling paper.
Late yesterday, 7:30 asked the government department assessing Kristen Gardner's application why it was taking so long. This afternoon, less than a day later, the sawmiller finally received word the funding was approved. In a written statement, Service New South Wales said, "It has received more than 34,000 applications for flood support. More than 4,000 have been paid so far. And in the last 48 hours, the department has made changes to make the process simpler for sole traders."
A $50,000 grant really doesn't go very far, but it does make a difference. It might help them keep a staff member on, or it might help to pay for all of the extra cleaning.
Many Lismore businesses face an uncertain future, and delays to special assistance funding make the recovery all the more complicated.
People want to go back, they want to restart their businesses, but every time they turn around, there's some other thing.
Unfortunately, we actually need help 6 weeks ago. Nobody understands until they come here how bad it really is.
And you can read the full statement from the New South Wales Department of Customer Service on our website. Now to the election campaign, where there has been an increasing focus on lifting stagnant wages. Opposition leader Anthony Albanese will join me shortly to discuss wages and other reform issues, many of which are largely absent from the campaign discussion. There are warnings that whoever wins will face tough decisions about economic reform to maintain living standards. This report from James Glenday.
Petrol prices around Australia have come down since the federal government halved the fuel excise in the budget.
So you're offering a great price. You guys better fill up. This is a good price.
The 6-month cut to the tax on each litre sold is just a temporary attempt to ease the cost of living ahead of the election.
It's temporary, it's targeted, it's affordable.
Well, this is a temporary change.
But some motoring groups fear political pressure could make the measure more permanent and think that would bode badly for the future of the nation's roads.
We find it very hard to believe that in September the Treasurer of the day is going to happily increase petrol prices by 25 cents a litre. It's already cost the budget $3 billion. They do this for another 6 months, 12 months. We're talking many billions of dollars not there for Transport Network.
The flat tax does not directly fund the Transport Network, but it is an important budget item that politicians regularly link to infrastructure like new bridges. Few people think about it, but if you drive an average petrol SUV, you're paying roughly $5 in excise for every 100 kilometres you drive. And if you have an electric car, then you, of course, don't pay it at all. For years now, there has been debate about replacing fuel excise with a new uniform national system of road user charges, and many believe the Commonwealth should now be playing more of a role.
It's completely unsustainable as a tax. I would like to think that when September rolls around and the Treasurer is tasked with increasing petrol prices by 25 cents overnight, I would think that's not a bad time to start a conversation about what our long-term tax system should look like, because the penetration of EVs, that's a great thing for the environment, it's a terrible thing for the federal budget.
It is curious to think that at an election in 2022, when tackling climate change is a top concern of many voters, one tax change both major parties agree on is a short-term cut to excise on fossil fuels. But neither of the men vying to become Prime Minister is discussing the longer-term problem of how to raise revenue from drivers in the future as we slowly transition to electric cars, or, for that matter, what to do about the overall state of Australia's finances, which have an ongoing shortfall.
Certainly over the next 10 years or so, we're not at the moment projected to head back into surplus anytime soon, and that level of debt is certainly on the increase and looking to be quite substantial, well over $1 trillion into the future.
ANU Professor Ben Phillips says that means at some point the federal government needs to reform and raise taxes, or cut spending, or grow the economy, and perhaps a combination of all three.
Growing the economy is always a noble goal, but difficult to necessarily achieve, particularly in the short to medium term.
The support for the floating of the dollar was clear.
Economists have long urged Australian politicians to look at longer-term and big-picture reforms akin to those pushed through in the 80s and 90s to boost productivity and our prosperity in the coming decades.
This very important discussion paper.
There is no shortage of ideas to fix the budget and grow the economy. For example, most of the proposals in the 2010 Henry Tax Review have gathered dust on a shelf.
Let's spend the taxpayers' money as though it is our money.
So have a number of the recommendations in Tony Shepherd's 2014 Commission of Audit.
The problem is that the community's got used to free or cheap money. We have to get them off that, and we have to also get the community to understand that economic reform really is the only way that we can protect ourselves for the future fiscally and economically and enjoy a higher standard of living.
Aside from introducing new road user charges, other ideas for reform often put forward include putting the GST on more items, pricing carbon emissions more effectively, and helping the states replace inefficient stamp duties with land taxes. But as recent history shows, those sorts of ideas can be very politically poisonous. Even many leading policy thinkers are reluctant to float them in a campaign because leaders are so often then asked to rule them out for the next 3 years.
For Australia to continue to grow and prosper, there always always needs to be a discussion around economic reform and also social reform. I think sometimes we forget that a good society is also a good economy. Unfortunately, it's been a pretty toxic one that we've had in recent years and even recent decades.
One economic issue that has been discussed at length in this campaign is how to boost the pay packets of workers. Unions are currently urging the industrial umpire to increase the minimum wage by 5.5% to $21.45 an hour, arguing if workers could see themselves getting ahead, then they might be open to broader reform.
Workers are becoming pretty frustrated with hearing wages will go up if productivity goes up, because productivity has gone up every single year and workers haven't seen the benefits of that.
Business groups want the pay increase to be limited to no more than 3%.
We have to have responsible wages outcomes that don't fuel inflation and end up adding to higher interest rates in the future.
The Prime Minister has indicated that's a concern for him too. Scott Morrison has repeatedly said he has no special wand to boost wages and argued that increases should be left to the industrial umpire.
We have always welcomed and accepted the recommendations that have come from that body. That is the appropriate way. Well, of course I do. That's why we've halved the petrol tax.
This is one area of major difference between the two leaders, and today Anthony Albanese declared the lowest earners in the country should get pay rises that at least keep up with the cost of living. It's a move that is likely to have some popular appeal, but it'll worry some business groups because inflation is currently at 5.1% and forecast to go even higher before the end of the year.
You said you don't want people to go backwards. Does that mean you would support a wage hike of at least 5.1% just to keep up with inflation?
Absolutely.
And secondly,
we think no one should go backwards. People should be at least keeping up with the cost of living.
I spoke to opposition leader Anthony Albanese a short time ago. Anthony Albanese, wages are a crucial issue in this election. You've made them a really important point. But can you explain to voters what it is a government can do to change basic wages?
Well, the first thing I'd say, Laura, is that the government wanted to deliberately keep wages low over the last decade, and they have. I deliberately want to see wages increase, and I will.
And how do you do that?
Well, you do that through a range of mechanisms, Laura. Importantly, what you need to do to increase wages at the same time as you increase profits is to increase productivity. And I spoke to the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry just last week about this. I will convene a full employment summit that brings unions and business together to talk about how we get wages moving, how we get business going, grow the economy in a way that the economy works for people, just not the other way around. There are a number of other specific measures that can happen as well. I believe very firmly that people who are on the minimum wage, which is just $20.33, shouldn't fall further behind. And I believe in particular sectors like the aged care sector, where the Royal Commission said unless we increase wages, people will leave the sector, more people will leave the sector, that we need to address that, and the government should make a submission to the Fair Work Commission for the case that's before it right now and say that they support a wage increase for people in the aged care sector.
What about in the minimum wage case, though? Would an Albanese government intervene in that case to make a case for wages to catch up with inflation?
Well, what we know is that at the last increase that the Fair Work Commission made was 2.5%, even though inflation was just 1.1%. So we know that the Fair Work Commission has taken these issues into account. We've clearly said that people should not fall further behind. It's one of the themes of my campaign at the moment, Laura, is no one left behind and no one held back. And the idea that people who are doing it really tough at the moment should have a further cut in their cost of living is, in my view, simply untenable.
What levers, though, does government have in the current system? I mean, do we need to look at overhauling the system? Both sides, the employers and unions, say the enterprise bargaining system is broken. We've seen wages continue to decline. You know, do we need to actually overhaul the Act?
Well, we need to have enterprise bargaining work effectively so that productivity drives those wages and profit increases at the same time. So we have a win-win. But we also need some structural changes. We'll make secure work an objective of the Act. We'll also make achieving pay equity for women an objective of the Act as well.
Well, feminised workforces include aged care, childcare, employment services and the NDIS. These are all sectors with contracted out workforces, but they're providing government services. Do you think we need to have another look at how these sectors work? And is this why we've got problems in those particular labour forces?
We need to make sure that we don't create a whole section of the labour market whereby people are competing in a race to the bottom. Someone says that they'll do this job for this amount and then someone undercuts them. These are issues that need to be looked at in order to ensure we get good outcomes, not just for workers, but also for the delivery of services.
One of the sort of overlooked bits of your campaign launch speech was that you were talking about bringing the principles of universality and affordability that we see in Medicare to childcare and aged care. That does suggest over time that we are going to see a bigger bill for the government, doesn't it?
Laura, we need to encourage the full economic participation of women. Women workers are underutilised, undervalued at the moment. And Australia has fallen to 70th in the world for economic participation and opportunity of women.
But this is going to go on the government tab though, isn't it?
Well, we need to do so much more across the board. And with childcare is a great example whereby it is not welfare. It's not about going on the government tab. What it's about is growing the economy. If you remove the distortion which is there that stops women working a fourth or a fifth day, what you'll get is a growth in workforce participation, you'll get a growth in productivity and a growth in the economy as a direct result of that, which is why business are crying out for this area of reform. It's good for equality, but it's also good for the entire economy, women and men, if we get the economy growing more strongly, if we get more productivity bonuses. And it also is good for those businesses to have those permanent workers, as well as being good for closing the gap that's there in the retirement incomes of women.
In the package that we've just seen from James Glenday, we talked about some of the reform issues and issues in the economy that aren't being discussed in the election. One of them is about the budget hole that's looming. You've talked about sort of some spending savings. You've sort of been a little bit vague about what you would do about tax beyond multinational tax changes. To quote a former leader of yours, does the reckless spending have to stop? And is there a good call for you to make to say, look, we are putting down some markers for what's going to happen to budget policy in the next 3 years?
Laura, we have put down those markers, and that's why we've identified our spending priorities as being things that will grow the economy and grow productivity. Whether it's childcare that we were just discussing, whether it's infrastructure directed towards productivity-boosting infrastructure, including the National Broadband Network, our energy reforms through our Powering Australia plan. These are measures that will grow the economy.
They're not budgetary measures, Mr Albanese.
Well,
otherwise you're just talking about what the government's talking about, which is growing your way out, not actually making any precise decisions yourself to cut spending.
Well, what we have done, Laura, is we haven't gone out when it comes to spending. What we haven't done is get out a colour-coded spreadsheet. We're talking about productivity-boosting infrastructure that grows the economy. Our Powering Australia plan will lead to $52 billion of private sector investment, 604,000 additional jobs by 2030, and making Australia a renewable energy superpower will be an enormous benefit for our economy. Good for the environment, but importantly, an economic driver, and using that to grow the economy so that our fiscal position is better in the future. We will inherit $1 trillion of debt. That's why we're being very careful about our spending commitments and making sure they're prioritised to things like making more things here, Powering Australia, childcare, better infrastructure and the NBN.
You've said you won't negotiate with the crossbench on getting support for a minority government because you're going for a win, but you ran the parliament when it was a minority government before, and you know that you have to negotiate. What's the scope for negotiating on climate and on the Integrity Commission? And do you still support the crossbench proposal for an Integrity Commission?
We'll have a government proposal for a National Anti-Corruption Commission. We certainly supported the crossbench proposals to be debated. We think the Parliament should have debated that legislation. But in government, of course, you can have the advice of departments, including the Attorney-General's department, to make sure that you get it right. And we're confident that we will. And we're confident that our model, which will be one that has serious powers, one that's independent of government, will receive overwhelming support of people like Helen Haynes and others, because it will be one with teeth, it will be one that's serious. And what's very clear is that the only way that Australia will get a National Anti-Corruption Commission is with the election of a Labor government.
If we have a parliament where we see a number of Teal candidates on the crossbench and a minority government, won't that be a vote for more action on climate change and give you scope to negotiate a tougher position on reducing emissions?
Well, we have a serious position on emissions reduction, and one of the things that we did, Laura, we didn't come up with a figure and then work out how to get there. What we did was come up with a serious plan that involves...
Will you come up with a better figure for 2030?
No, we'll come up with the figure that we're taking to this election, which is 43%, which is consistent with getting to net zero by 2050, which is consistent with the support that we've got for this plan. This is a chance to end the climate wars. This plan that we've put forward has the support of the Business Council, Australian Industry Group, Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the National Farmers Federation and the ACTU. We need to stop the debate, give business the certainty that they need, and take advantage of the opportunity that is there from acting on climate change. It will be good for the economy, good for jobs. At the same time, we'll join the world effort in order to tackle the great challenge that is climate change. We've seen with the floods and the bushfires, the challenge is here right now. The issues are there right now, which is why we will act.
Mr Albanese, thanks for your time tonight.
Thanks very much, Laura.
7:30 has made repeated requests to interview the Prime Minister during this campaign. Our invitation remains open. The agency running the National Disability Insurance Scheme spruiks itself as a model employer for Australians with disabilities. But an ABC investigation has uncovered claims from NDIA staff with disabilities of discrimination and human rights breaches. Tonight, some of those workers are exposing what they say are serious failings. This report from Pat McGrath and Sarah Curnow.
I've always had a sort of a creative urge, and I like building stuff and things like that, so yeah.
Adam Cooper's not someone who's afraid of a challenge.
I have retinitis pigmentosa, which is a genetic and degenerative eye disease. It means all the vision in the central part of my eye is lost, so I can get around the place, but detail is really problematic for me. As long as I take the time to set up everything right, it's going all right so far. I've still got all my fingers.
In 2019, the National Disability Insurance Agency brought Adam on to help make its IT systems accessible for staff with vision impairment. He knew it would be a big job.
I thought it was a fantastic opportunity as someone with a vision impairment and who's been working in the digital accessibility space for more than a decade. The software is called JAWS, or Job Access with Speech. It's one of the more common screen readers around.
Is this what the NDIA would be using typically, JAWS?
It is the only screen reader, as far as I understand, that they're using, yeah.
The problem was the JAWS screen reader that vision impaired staff used couldn't read lots of information about NDIS participants held on its database, so the staff couldn't do their jobs quickly or sometimes at all, and JAWS wasn't the only problem.
You'd have these ridiculous situations where the business processes that require blind people to print out a letter, sign it and then put it in an envelope and send it to a participant. That's just nonsensical in my view.
A year into the job, Adam's efforts to get the problems fixed were going nowhere.
But then over time, it just became just much like any other government department with digital accessibility, that you would encounter the same kinds of roadblocks. You know, it's too expensive, or it's too hard, or, you know, it's not such a priority.
The NDIA describes itself as an employer of choice for Australians with disability and has a goal of making 15% of its staff made up of workers with disability. But for workers who couldn't see the information in participants' files, the job had to change, either by reducing their performance targets or other measures.
They are either moved to another position, or eventually they're just sort of pushed out of the organisation. You know, because at the end of the day, they can't do the job.
What impact does that have on people, do you think?
I think it's soul destroying.
In July last year, Adam quit in frustration.
Treating the staff with disability as a lower priority in terms of being able to access systems as clearly discriminatory. Having a disability is hard enough. You don't need to have it rubbed in your face, if you like, and go to your dream job in the NDIA only to be told that you're just not worthy of it.
The NDIA's chief executive, Martin Hoffman, declined to do an interview to answer the concerns of staff, but in a statement the agency insisted that no staff are managed out for having a disability. It says it's a leader in assistive technology and the vast majority of its systems are compatible with JAWS, but that's not what multiple staff have told us. And the problems don't just affect doing the work, it extends to the training on how to do the work.
Honestly, I don't want sympathy. I just want understanding, so I can do my job. Hello.
Kerry-Ann Minjute has had a vision disability since childhood and jumped at the opportunity to work at the NDIA in Perth when it launched in 2014.
I'm so passionate about the scheme, and I really wanted to be there from the beginning to see it, watch it grow and develop, and the difference it could make to people's lives.
The NDIA made her a star employee, featuring her photograph in its 2015 annual report. She's now risking her job by speaking publicly about disability discrimination she claims started on her second day of work during a training session delivered by PowerPoint.
I couldn't see the screens. They have two big TVs on the wall, and a lot of the work is done on there. Within the second day of the training, I was down with one of the directors crying because I felt I wasn't included. I was the only one there with a vision impairment. I felt really singled, like an idiot. I felt stupid, and I'm not stupid.
This is to teach you how to do your job, right? This is the training material.
And I can't even read this.
I can just read it. I can just make it out.
At her most recent training in November, she was given a printed workflow chart for her new job that she can't even read, held right up to her face.
Yeah, I don't see any of it.
Kerry-Ann says she met her performance targets at the NDIA for 8 years because she taught herself how to use its systems.
And I know my job, and I've trained myself, and everything is going smoothly, and then they move me to another team and they got to try again. We start all over again because they have no idea. We were all put in one team at one point, all the people with disability, like we were in the too hard basket. That's how I felt.
The agency wouldn't tell us why it made that decision. Eventually, Kerry-Ann took sick leave and lodged a workers' compensation claim alleging disability discrimination in her job.
It just makes me feel useless and worthless because no one understands. It's like I'm talking to a brick wall.
ABC Investigations has spoken to more than a dozen current and former NDIA staff who say they've faced disability discrimination in their jobs. At least 6 NDIA staff have sued the agency for alleged discrimination in the past 5 years. Their claims include not having the right software to do their jobs, photocopiers or even toilet paper out of reach of staff in wheelchairs, or there's no ramp at an emergency exit. In each case, the agency has quietly settled and got the worker to sign a gag order so they can't tell their stories publicly, something the agency says is commonplace in the public service.
The National Disability Insurance Agency has an appalling record when it comes to the treatment of people with a disability. And it's so disappointing because these are the employees who have lived experience of disability. So many people have come to the union talking about the fact that they are not getting the support that they need.
The union representing NDIA staff says that lack of support is compounded by a broader problem of unsustainable workloads on staff. Last year, it complained to the regulator Comcare about unsafe workloads causing psychological harm to staff. And in January, Comcare found the NDIA was contravening OH&S legislation. In its statement to 7:30, the NDIA says the final Comcare report cleared it of a formal breach. It insists disability discrimination is not a widespread problem at the agency, but it regrets what it calls a very small number of people who feel they've not had a positive experience. It says 19% of its employees have a disability, and it is a community leader in hiring and supporting staff with disability.
The scheme is fantastic and can be better, but the agency needs a lot of work. Who's delivering the scheme right now? Especially for the employees with disability. Yep, 100%.
That's the program for tonight. Thanks for your company. Good night.
Every Thursday on Q&A, we put your questions to our nation's leaders.
I'm really just looking for a candidate and a party who I know I can trust.
Are you confident right now? 2.5 weeks to go.
Nothing says the law of diminishing returns quite like Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government.
Coming up, undecided voters put their questions to Paul Fletcher, Simon Reynolds, Caroline DeRusso and Intifar Chowdhury. Plus, live music from Vicar and Linda. Q&A, Thursday.
Everybody say babies!
Babies! A new season brings new joy. Congratulations.